The stars above Eden Prime were the most beautiful in the known galaxy. That was the first thing every colonist said when they stepped off the transport ships and looked up at the sky for the very first time. The planet sat in a rare pocket of the Orion Arm where three separate nebulas overlapped at the edges of the atmosphere. One violet, one deep amber, one soft electric blue, and at night, those colors bled together across the horizon like a painting made by something that had too much love and nowhere else to put it. Eden Prime was humanity's greatest achievement outside of Earth itself. It had taken 42 years to terraform. 42 years of automated atmospheric processors churning day and night, converting the raw chemical soup of a barren rock into something breathable, something livable, something that smelled like rain and pine trees and fresh soil after a storm. 42 years of orbital platforms seeding the clouds with water molecules, of deep-bore machines cracking the crust open and pulling up the minerals that would feed the soil, of genetic engineers releasing carefully calibrated microbe colonies into the dirt to make it rich and dark and alive. 42 years. And then people came. The first wave was 12,000 colonists, mostly scientists and engineers and agricultural specialists. They came in the year 2287, stepping off their transport ships with shaking hands and wide eyes, and they planted the first seeds of what would become New Chicago, the planet's capital city, right there in the flat valley between two gentle mountain ranges that the survey teams had already named the Shepherd's Arms. By 2341, Eden Prime had a population of 2,300,000 people. They had schools. They had hospitals. They had parks where children ran through fields of transplanted earth grass, laughing and chasing the small native insects that the scientists had determined were harmless, little creatures that looked like dragonflies but had 4 sets of iridescent wings instead of 2, and they glowed faintly gold in the late afternoon sun, and the children called them sparks. They had a university. They had a symphony orchestra. They had a government building with tall windows that caught the morning light and threw rainbows across the marble floors. They had a cemetery on the eastern hill, where the people who had died building this place were buried under white stones, and where families came on Sunday mornings to leave flowers and to remember. They had a communications array in orbit, a massive, delicate structure of silver and carbon fiber that beamed messages back to Earth at regular intervals, keeping the colony connected to home across the 47 light-years that separated them. The last message that array ever sent was received on Earth on March 14, 2341. It was a routine status update. Population census numbers. Agricultural yield reports. A request for an updated medical supply shipment. A note from the university's astronomy department about a new observation they had made regarding a pulsar in the nearby star cluster. And could they please get a peer review from the team at the University of Mumbai? Standard. Ordinary. Completely unremarkable. That was the last anyone on Earth ever heard from Eden Prime. When the silence started, nobody panicked right away. Communication delays happened. Arrays went offline for maintenance. Relay stations sometimes experienced technical failures that could take weeks to diagnose and repair across the vast distances of space. The galaxy was not a quiet or cooperative place, and the infrastructure that held human civilization together across its scattered colonies was always fragile at the edges. So Earth waited. The United Earth Space Command (USC) noted the silence in their logs on day 3 and filed a routine inquiry. Technicians checked the relay stations along the corridor between Earth and Eden Prime. They found nothing wrong. The stations were operational. The problem, whatever it was on the Eden Prime end. On day 7, USC dispatched a scout ship. Not a warship, just a small, fast courier vessel called the Meridian, crewed by 11 people, equipped with high-resolution long-range sensors and a communications specialist whose job was to figure out what had gone wrong with the array and get it back online. The Meridian was given an estimated travel time of 19 days. On day 26, when the Meridian had not reported in and had not arrived back at Earth, USC elevated the situation to priority amber. They dispatched 3 more ships, 2 scout vessels and 1 light frigate for escort, and they notified the Colonial Affairs Office, who notified the Secretary General, who notified the Security Council. The Security Council met on April 10, 2341. They sat around the long oval table in the council chamber in Geneva and they looked at each other, and nobody said what they were all thinking because saying it out loud felt like making it real, and none of them wanted it to be real. But it was already real. It had been real for almost a month. They just didn't know it yet. Commander Rachel Torres was the senior officer aboard the UES Sentinel, one of the 3 ships dispatched on day 26. She was 41 years old, 16 years in the service, with a face that looked like it had made peace with a lot of difficult things and had the quiet steadiness of someone who had learned that panic was a luxury you couldn't afford when other people's lives depended on your decisions. She had been to Eden Prime once before, 6 years ago, as part of a diplomatic escort for a colonial affairs delegation. She remembered the light. She remembered the way the valley around New Chicago looked from orbit, that lush, impossible green against the rust-red mountains, the silver threads of rivers catching the sunlight, the white geometry of the city spreading out like an opened hand in the center of all that beauty. She was thinking about that image when the Sentinel dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Eden Prime system and her sensor officer, Lieutenant James Obi, went very, very quiet. Obi. Her voice was calm. It was always calm. Report. James Obi had been in the service for 4 years. He was 28 years old and he had a gift for reading sensor data the way some people had a gift for reading music. Intuitively, fast, accurately, as if the numbers and graphs spoke directly to some part of his brain that was wired differently from everyone else's. He was good at his job. He stared at his console for 6 full seconds before he spoke. Commander. Pause. I'm reading debris. Across the entire orbital plane. Metal, carbon compounds, crystallized atmospheric gases. Another pause longer. I'm also reading thermal decay signatures across the planet's surface. Widespread. Consistent with high-energy weapons discharge. The bridge went silent. Rachel Torres kept her hands flat on the arms of her command chair and kept her breathing even and said very quietly, "How widespread?" "The entire planetary surface, Commander." James Obi's voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "The thermal signatures are everywhere. I'm not reading any active communications from the surface. I'm not reading any power signatures from the city grids. I'm not reading any..." He stopped. Swallowed. "I'm not reading any biological signs consistent with human activity." Rachel closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and said, "Get me a visual on New Chicago." The main screen at the front of the bridge shifted from the star map to a live feed from the Sentinel's optical sensors, enhanced and sharpened by the ship's imaging processors. It took a moment to resolve. And then it did. New Chicago was gone. Not damaged. Not partially destroyed. Gone. The valley between the Shepherd's Arms was a flat, scorched plain of fused glass and ash, stretching for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The mountain ranges that had once framed the city like cupped hands were cracked and blackened, their peaks sheared off, their slopes covered in the residue of energy so vast they had melted rock to liquid and then cooled it in seconds. The rivers were gone. The fields were gone. The university, the hospitals, the schools, the government building with its rainbow floors, gone, 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 all gone. The cemetery on the eastern hill, the one with the white stones and the Sunday morning flowers, was a smooth plain of dark glass. 2,300,000 people. Gone. "Oh God," someone on the bridge said. Rachel didn't look to see who. She sat in her command chair and she looked at what used to be New Chicago and she felt something move through her that was not panic and was not grief. Those would come later, in the dark, when she was alone. What moved through her now was something older and colder and much, much quieter. She reached forward and opened a channel to the other 2 ships. "All stations, this is Commander Torres aboard the Sentinel. We have confirmed what happened to Eden Prime. This is no longer a search and rescue operation." She paused. "I am formally elevating this to a priority red incident and requesting immediate communication with UESC Command. All ships hold position at the system edge. Nobody approaches the planet until Command gives the order." She closed the channel. Then she turned to her communications officer and said, "Get me Earth." The message that Rachel Torres sent back to Earth took 47 light-years to travel. By the time it arrived, she had already spent 11 days cataloging the wreckage. Not because Command had asked her to. Because she needed to do something with her hands and her mind while she waited, because the alternative was to sit still and let the weight of what she was looking at collapse inward, and she could not afford that. So she documented. She sent probes into the debris field in orbit. There were pieces of the communications array up there. She recognized the carbon fiber architecture from the schematics in the ship's database. There were also pieces of other things. Things that were not human-made. Fragments of material with a molecular structure that her science officer, Dr. Maya Chin, spent 3 days analyzing before she came to Rachel's ready room and sat down across the desk and said, "Commander, whoever did this was not human." Rachel looked at her. "We already knew that." "Yes. But now I can tell you who they are." Maya pulled up a holographic display from the pad in her hand. The material fragments we recovered from the debris field matched the hull composition of Vethian warships. I cross-referenced against the xenological database from the First Contact archive. The Vethians. Rachel had heard the name. Everyone in the service had. The Vethians were one of 11 known spacefaring species in the galaxy, and they were, by any measurement, among the most powerful. They were an old civilization, older than humanity by at least 8,000 years, and they were known for two things: their absolute belief in their own superiority, and their complete intolerance for what they called contamination of what they considered their territorial space. Eden Prime is 40 light-years from the nearest Vethian territorial boundary, Rachel said. We are nowhere near their space. No, Maya said. We're not. She paused. But apparently they think we are. Rachel stared at the display for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "How many ships were in the attack?" Maya pulled up the next screen. Based on the energy discharge calculations and the spread pattern of the thermal signatures across the planet's surface, I'd estimate between 40 and 60 Vethian warships. Possibly more. 40 to 60 warships. Against a civilian colony with no military presence whatsoever. Against 2,300,000 people who had schools and hospitals and parks and a symphony orchestra and a cemetery on the Eastern Hill where they brought flowers on Sunday mornings. Rachel Torres sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her ready room and breathed in and breathed out and let that cold, quiet thing inside her grow a little colder. "Send all of this to Earth," she said. "Everything. Every scan, every fragment analysis, every piece of data we have." She paused. "And Maya? Commander? Make absolutely certain the attribution is airtight. I want there to be no question. No ambiguity. No room for anyone to say we made a mistake." Maya nodded. "Understood." She left. Rachel stayed at her desk. She thought about a child running through a field of transplanted earth grass, chasing little creatures with 4 sets of glowing wings, laughing at the sky. She thought about 47 light-years of distance between what she was looking at right now and the people on Earth who didn't know yet. She thought about what would happen when they found out. Absymhhy pada. From this moment she knew, the galaxy was never going to be the same again. The message from Commander Rachel Torres reached Earth on April 21, 2341. It arrived first at the UESC Communications Hub in orbit above Earth, where an automated system flagged it as priority red and routed it simultaneously to the offices of the UESC Commander-in-Chief, the United Earth Security Council, the Secretary-General's private communications channel, and the emergency alert system of every military installation on the planet. It took 47 minutes for every person who needed to read it. For the next 6 hours, the most powerful people on Earth sat in various rooms in various buildings in various time zones and they read the documentation that Rachel Torres had sent them, and they looked at the images of what used to be New Chicago, and they did not sleep and they did not eat and they barely spoke. And then, slowly the silence broke. The first person to speak in the Security Council chamber, after the images were displayed on the main screen and everyone had been sitting in silence for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, was General Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was 63 years old. He was the Commander-in-Chief of the United Earth Space Command. He had served in the military for 38 years, had commanded 3 separate fleet actions during the border disputes with the Kreth Dominion in the 2310s, and had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from something hard and left in the weather for a long time. He looked at the image of New Chicago, the scorched plain, the fused glass, the sheared mountains, for a very long time. And then he turned to the room and said, in a voice that was completely, absolutely, terrifyingly quiet, "We are going to make them pay for this." Nobody argued. The news reached the general public on April 23, 2341. They tried to control it. Of course they did. The Security Council voted 7-3 to delay the public announcement by 48 hours to allow for verification and policy preparation, which really meant they wanted time to figure out what to say and how to say it without causing a complete breakdown of civil order on a planet of 12 billion people. They got their 48 hours. They used them. They had speeches prepared, briefings scheduled, crisis counselors standing by at government offices on every continent. They had mental health hotlines staffed to triple their normal capacity. They had police and security forces on quiet alert in every major city. And then the announcement was made, and none of those preparations mattered at all, because there is no way to prepare 12 billion people for the news that 2,300,000 of their sons and daughters and mothers and fathers and friends and children have been murdered. The world stopped. Not metaphorically. Literally. Markets stopped trading. Trains stopped running, not because of any official order but because the operators just stopped. They were sitting in their cabs and they heard the announcement come through the speakers and they just stopped. Factories went quiet. Restaurants closed. Schools sent children home early because the teachers were crying and couldn't continue. In New York City, a spontaneous gathering formed in Central Park that within 6 hours had grown to 300,000 people, standing together in the April cold, not chanting or protesting, just standing together because nobody wanted to be alone with this. The same thing happened in London, in Beijing, in Mumbai, in Lagos, and Sao Paulo. People just moved toward each other, drawn by some deep instinct that said, be together right now, be together, don't be alone with this. The grief was immense. But underneath the grief, from the very beginning, there was something else. Something harder. Something hotter. Something that burned steady and did not go out. Captain Daniel Hayes was sitting in a bar in Sydney, Australia, when the announcement came through. He was 37 years old, a fighter pilot in the Earth Defense Fleet, currently on leave after completing a 6-month patrol rotation along the outer colony corridor. He had a glass of something amber in his hand and a friend named Pete across the table, and they were having the kind of easy, pointless conversation that you can only have when you're genuinely relaxed and genuinely happy and genuinely not thinking about anything important. The bar had a screen on the wall. The screen showed a news anchor whose face had gone the color of old paper. Daniel set down his glass. Pete stopped talking mid-sentence. They watched. When it was over, Daniel sat very still for a moment. Then he put some money on the table, more than the bill, didn't bother counting it, and stood up. Danny, Pete said. Hey, where are you going? Back to base, Daniel said. You're on leave for another 2 weeks. Not anymore. He paused at the door. They're going to call it. I know they're going to call it. I want to be there when they do. He was right. The recall order came through at 0300 the next morning, sent simultaneously to every active duty member of the United Earth Space Command, every reservist, every retired officer below the age of 65, and every military contractor with active clearance. Report immediately to your assigned posting. Daniel Hayes reported at 0247 13 minutes before the order arrived, because he had gone back to the base and sat in the briefing room and waited because he knew. The mobilization that followed was unlike anything in human history. Earth had been building its military for decades, ever since the first contact era had made it brutally clear that the galaxy was not a peaceful place and that humanity's only hope of surviving in it was to be more capable of violence than anyone who might want to harm them. Not more aggressive, the Security Council had very strict policies about that, but more capable. Ready. Prepared. The Earth Defense Fleet, at the time of the Eden Prime massacre, consisted of approximately 470,000 warships of various classes, from the massive dreadnoughts that served as fleet flagships all the way down to the nimble, fast strike craft that could move in groups of 100 and hit targets with devastating precision before any enemy could respond. 470,000 ships. It was the largest military force any human civilization had ever assembled. It had seemed like enough. 4 border patrols, for colony defense, for deterrence against the various alien powers that watched humanity's expansion with varying degrees of suspicion and hostility. It had seemed like enough. It was not going to be enough for what Marcus Webb and the Security Council had in mind. On April 25, 2341, 2 days after the public announcement, the Security Council voted unanimously to invoke emergency war powers. This gave the military the authority to immediately begin emergency production of warships at every shipyard and manufacturing facility capable of producing them, to conscript industrial capacity from the private sector, to pull raw materials from every available source, and to do all of this without the normal legislative approval processes that would have taken months or years. They had 18 months. That was General Webb's timeline. 18 months to produce enough additional warships to bring the Earth Defense Fleet to a strength that would make what they were planning not just possible but absolute. Not just a retaliation. An answer so complete, so overwhelming, so utterly beyond anything the Vethians had experienced or expected, that it would be the last conversation they ever had about the subject. He wanted 700,000 warships. The engineers told him it was impossible. He told them to do it anyway. The shipyards worked around the clock. They had always been busy. The peaceful expansion of human civilization across dozens of colony worlds required a constant stream of transport ships, supply vessels, science platforms, communication arrays, and yes, military craft for patrol and escort duty. The shipyards of Earth orbit, of Luna, of Mars, of the asteroid belt processing stations had always been humming with activity. But this was different. This was every available human being working every available hour with every available resource directed toward a single purpose. The great orbital platforms above Earth, platforms that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, their frameworks studded with construction bays and robotic assembly systems and the sparkling lights of welders working in vacuum, began producing warships at a rate that made the previous records look casual. New construction bays were added. New platforms were assembled. Automated mining operations in the asteroid belt were redirected entirely to feeding raw material to the shipyards, and the great cargo haulers ran in continuous loops, never stopping, always moving, always carrying. On Earth's surface, manufacturing plants that had been making agricultural equipment were retooled for weapons systems. Research facilities that had been studying xenobiology shifted their focus to weapons research. Universities opened accelerated engineering programs specifically to train the technicians and operators and pilots who would be needed. Everyone understood what was happening. And everyone, almost everyone, wanted to help. The volunteer lists for military service opened on April 27th. By the end of the first day, 4 million people had signed up. By the end of the first week, it was 31 million. The processing centers were overwhelmed. They had to build temporary facilities hastily assembled in the parking lots and sports fields of every major city, just to handle the sheer volume of people who showed up, who stood in lines that stretched for blocks, who waited for hours in the rain and heat and cold, to put their names on the list. They were young and old. They were mechanics and teachers and farmers and students. They were people who had never held a weapon in their lives and people who had dedicated their entire adult years to military service. They were people who had lost someone on Eden Prime, a cousin, a childhood friend, a former colleague, and people who had never had any connection to the colony at all, who were there simply because 2,300,000 people had been murdered and something inside them said, "This cannot stand." In the offices of the Security Council, the diplomatic channels were burning hot. The Vethians had said nothing. That was the most extraordinary thing in its way. The attack on Eden Prime had not been accompanied by any communication. No declaration of war, no territorial claim, no demand, no explanation. The Vethians had sent their ships, destroyed a human colony and then simply returned to their space. As if they had done something entirely unremarkable. As if they had stepped on an insect. Earth's ambassadors to the various alien powers in the galaxy were working frantically to understand what had happened, to gather information, to figure out the Vethian motivation. What they found was deeply unsettling. The Vethian hegemony, as their civilization was formally known, operated under a worldview that was, to human understanding, essentially incomprehensible in its arrogance. They believed, with absolute conviction, that they were the apex species of the galaxy. Not just the most powerful or the most advanced, the most correct, the most legitimate, the most deserving of existence. All other spacefaring species were tolerated in proportion to how useful they were and how far they stayed out of Vethian business. Species that were old enough and powerful enough to be genuinely dangerous were given careful, cold respect. Species that were new and small and weak were treated with something between indifference and contempt. Humanity, in the Vethian worldview, was new and small and weak. And apparently, according to intelligence gathered by Earth's ambassador to the Kreth Dominion, who had their own long and painful history with the Vethians and were willing to share what they knew, Eden Prime had been built in a region of space that the Vethians had, at some point in the last century, quietly marked as their future expansion zone. Not their territory. Not anywhere near their territory. Not anywhere they had ever settled or patrolled or even visited, in any recorded instance for at least 300 years. But on their maps. In their planning documents. A circle drawn around a section of the Orion Arm, including the Eden Prime system, that said, in effect, "This is ours eventually." And when human colonists had moved in and built a thriving civilization there, the Vethians had apparently decided, without telling anyone, without any warning, that this was an act of territorial aggression requiring military response. So they had sent 60 warships. And they had erased a world. And they had said nothing. Because in their view you did not explain yourself to insects. Earth's ambassador to the Vethian hegemony was a woman named Dr. Sarah Okafor. She had spent 20 years studying the Vethians. She spoke their primary language with enough fluency to conduct technical negotiations. She understood their culture in the way that only a person who has devoted their life to understanding something can understand it, not just the surface forms and protocols, but the deep logic underneath, the values and assumptions that made their behavior make sense to them even when it was incomprehensible to everyone else. She requested an urgent audience with the Vethian High Council. She was kept waiting for 9 days. When they finally agreed to receive her, she was brought into a chamber that was designed, she knew, specifically to communicate the Vethians' contempt for the species they were dealing with. The ceiling was low, uncomfortably low for a human because the Vethians were taller and to them it felt normal, but the architects had subtly adjusted the proportions to make the human ambassador feel small. The chair she was given was slightly the wrong height. The lighting was tuned to a spectrum that was optimal for Vethian visual processing and slightly uncomfortable for human eyes. All of these were deliberate choices. Sarah Okafor noticed all of them, and she sat in the chair and she kept her face perfectly composed, and she waited for the High Council to address her. When they did, the lead counselor spoke to her in his own language, not the trade language that both species were capable of using, and one of his aides offered a translation. This was another deliberate choice. Another small assertion of hierarchy. The translation when it came was, "Speak." Sarah Okafor spoke. She spoke for 11 minutes in formal, precise Vethian, not the trade language, his language, the one he had used to try to establish hierarchy, laying out Earth's position. The Eden Prime colony. The population. The timeline of the attack. The evidence attributing the attack to Vethian military forces. The complete absence of any prior communication or diplomatic warning. The violation of recognized interstellar law regarding civilian populations. She spoke calmly. She did not beg. She did not threaten. She presented facts. When she was finished, the lead counselor was quiet for a moment. Then he said in his own language without looking at her, "The matter is closed. The contamination has been removed. This audience is ended." Sarah Okafor sat in her chair and looked at him. She thought about the 12 billion people on Earth who were right now building warships. She thought about Marcus Webb and his 18-month timeline. She thought about Daniel Hayes and the 31 million volunteers. She thought about Commander Rachel Torres sitting in her ship above a plane of fused glass. She thought about all of that. And then she said in perfectly clear Vethian without raising her voice, "I understand your position. I want you to understand mine. Humanity does not forget. And humanity does not stop." She stood up. She walked out. Behind her in the chamber the High Council said nothing. They did not believe her. Caro, that was their first and most fatal mistake. Part 3, Warriors Made from Grief. Lieutenant Commander James Obi got his promotion 6 weeks after returning from Eden Prime. He did not feel good about it. The promotion came with a new posting. He was transferred from the Sentinel to the UES Resolute, a brand new Horizon-class heavy cruiser that had just come off the construction docks at Lunar Shipyard 7. The Resolute was 3 times the size of the Sentinel with a crew of 412, a weapons payload that could have cracked a moon, and sensor systems so advanced that they could resolve individual structures on a planetary surface from a distance of 2 light-years. It was, by any objective measure, an extraordinary ship. James Obi walked its corridors and ran his hand along its walls and thought about New Chicago. He thought about the children who had chased sparks through fields of grass. He had found, in the wreckage data, the biological trace signatures of the insects, the little dragonfly creatures with 4 glowing wings, still detectable in the fused glass, their molecular patterns preserved by the speed of the destruction. He had found them and he had logged them and he had not told anyone about it because he wasn't sure he could describe them without losing his composure, and he needed his composure for what was coming. He had requested, when the transfer offer came through, that he be assigned to the Retribution fleet, the fleet that was being assembled for the operation that everyone was calling, without any official designation, simply the answer. His request was granted without comment. The answer was the most ambitious military operation in human history. General Marcus Webb had conceived it in its broad outlines on the night he first read Rachel Torres's report, sitting in his office in the early hours of April 22nd, the city of Geneva quiet and dark outside his window, the images of Eden Prime open on his screen. He had spent 6 weeks refining it, working with his admirals and strategists and intelligence officers and logistical planners, running models and simulations and scenario analyses until he had something that was not just emotionally satisfying but tactically coherent. The core concept was simple. The Vethian hegemony maintained military power through a network of 17 fortified strongholds distributed across their territorial space. Massive installations, each capable of housing thousands of warships, each linked to the others by a rapid response relay system that allowed them to reinforce any point under attack within a matter of hours. It was a brilliant defensive architecture. It had kept the Vethians safe from every challenger for 800 years. It had one weakness. The relay system required 17 relay stations, 1 per stronghold, plus a central coordination hub located in the Vethian home system. If you destroyed the relay stations faster than the Vethians could respond to the attacks, the strongholds became isolated, cut off from each other, unable to coordinate. Each one powerful, yes, but powerful only against whatever fleet you sent against it, with no ability to call for help. You would need 17 attack fleets striking simultaneously, plus a separate force to neutralize the central hub. Each attack fleet would need to be large enough to overwhelm a Vethian stronghold even without facing reinforcement, which meant, given what the intelligence services knew about Vethian military strength, each fleet would need to consist of approximately 40,000 warships. 17 fleets of 40,000 ships was 680,000 ships. Plus a central fleet for the home system hub, another 20,000. 700,000 warships. Webb had not picked the number randomly. He had reverse-engineered it from the operational requirement and arrived at a force size that was, by his calculations, not just adequate but overwhelming. Not just overwhelming but absolute. He was not planning to give the Vethians a chance to fight back effectively. He was planning to end the fight before it started. The months passed. The shipyards worked. The volunteers trained. The weapons research teams produced new systems, faster and more powerful than anything that had existed before, and the manufacturing plants produced them by the millions, and the supply chains carried them to the ships, and the ships grew more capable every week. And the names were read. This had begun spontaneously in the first week after the announcement. Someone in New Chicago's sister city in Australia, a small community of Eden Prime emigrants who had returned to Earth for medical treatment or family reasons and had thus survived, had stood up in a public square and started reading names aloud from a list they had compiled from the colonial records. 2,300,000 names. The reading had been taken up. Volunteer teams organized themselves around the planet, working in shifts, reading names continuously around the clock. At the rate they were going, it would take approximately 14 months to read all 2,300,000 names. They didn't stop. In the shipyards, workers listened to the broadcast. In the training facilities, soldiers listened during breaks. In the briefing rooms and command centers and pilot quarters of ships being readied for the mission, people listened. Every name was a person. Every person had a life. Every life had been ended without warning, without reason, without mercy. The reading continued. And with every name read, something in the people who heard it was forged a little harder. General Webb held his first full admiral's briefing on the operational plan on October 3, 2341, 6 months after the Eden Prime massacre. There were 23 admirals in the room. They were the best military minds that humanity had produced. They had studied warfare their entire professional lives. They had commanded fleets in the disputed zones, had negotiated territorial agreements with alien powers, had run the math on every major military scenario in the known galaxy hundreds of times. When Webb presented the full plan, the simultaneous strike at all 17 strongholds, the destruction of the relay system, the coordinated attack on the central hub, they did not immediately agree. Not because they objected to the goal. They did not. Every person in that room would have described the response in stronger terms than Webb did, if they had been asked privately. They objected because they were good at their jobs, and good people who are good at their jobs ask hard questions before they commit to something irreversible. Our intelligence on Vethian stronghold strength is 8 years old, said Admiral Patricia Chin, the fleet's chief of strategic intelligence. We don't know what they've built in 8 years. Our models account for a 30% capability increase, Webb said. Even with that margin, the force ratios hold. The simultaneous strike requires all 17 fleets to arrive within the same 6-minute window, said Admiral James Kowalski, the fleet's chief of operations. That is a coordination problem of extraordinary complexity. Which is why we have 14 months to train and rehearse it, Webb said. We will run the simulation until it is reflex. Until every fleet commander can execute it in their sleep. What about the civilian populations? Said Admiral Dr. Yara Santos, the fleet's judge advocate general. She said it quietly but clearly. The Vethian strongholds are military installations, but they're in systems that have civilian habitation. We cannot. We will not touch civilians, Webb said. The quiet in his voice was absolute. Our targets are military installations, military ships, military command infrastructure. Any commander who engages civilian targets will be court-martialed. I want that in writing in every operational order. I want it briefed to every ship captain before we leave. We are not what they are. He paused. We are not what they are. But we will make them feel what they did. Silence in the room. Then Admiral Chin said, when is the deployment date? October 14, 2342, Webb said. 18 months from the date of the massacre. That gives us 12 months from today. Yes. Another pause. It can be done, Kowalski said, slowly, like a man working through a calculation and arriving at an answer he didn't expect. It will be the hardest thing any of us has ever attempted. But it can be done. One by one around the table the other admirals nodded. Daniel Hayes was assigned to the 44th Strike Wing, one of the fighter units that would be embedded in the fleet attacking Vethian Stronghold 9. He had, in the 6 months since April, become a different person. Not visibly, he still looked like Daniel Hayes, still had the same face and the same way of standing and the same habits that his squadmates had known for years. But there was something behind his eyes that had not been there before. Something settled and cold and completely purposeful. He threw himself into the additional training with an intensity that worried some of his colleagues and made others quietly match it. He flew simulations until the scenarios were so familiar he could run them in his head. He studied Vethian tactical doctrine. The translated intelligence reports were dense and technical and hard-going, but he read them all twice, making notes in the margins, looking for patterns, looking for the places where the Vethian approach to combat had weaknesses that a smart pilot could exploit. He found several. The Vethians were supremely confident in their technology, understandably since it was excellent, but that confidence made them somewhat inflexible. They had doctrine for dealing with smaller forces, doctrine for dealing with equivalent forces, doctrine for dealing with larger forces. What they did not have doctrine for, as far as Daniel could tell from the intelligence reports, was dealing with forces so overwhelmingly large that the tactical calculus simply ceased to apply. They had never had to think about that in 800 years. They were going to have to think about it now. He wrote up his analysis and submitted it through the chain of command, expecting it to disappear into some staff officer's inbox and never be heard of again. 3 weeks later, he was summoned to a meeting with his wing commander, who had forwarded his analysis up the chain, and the analysis had ended up on Admiral Chen's desk, and Admiral Chen had read it and agreed with its core conclusions and wanted to meet the pilot who had written it. Daniel Hayes, fighter pilot, 20-month post-Eden Prime version, sat across a table from Patricia Chen, Admiral, and talked for 2 hours about Vethian tactical psychology and how to exploit it. When the meeting was over, she told him he'd be getting another promotion. He told her he didn't care about the promotion. She looked at him for a moment and said, "I know. That's exactly why you're getting it." 6 months before deployment, Commander Rachel Torres was given command of a ship. Not the Sentinel. The Sentinel had been redesigned, upgraded, reclassified. The ship she was given was the UES Memory of Eden, a Redemption-class heavy battleship, the largest class of warship humanity had ever built. It was 1.4 kilometers long. It carried a crew of 2,108 people. Its weapon systems included 12 primary mass driver cannons capable of accelerating projectiles to a meaningful fraction of the speed of light, 48 secondary energy weapon emplacements, and a missile complement that could, in theory, maintain continuous fire against multiple targets for 72 hours. It was the most powerful ship Rachel Torres had ever set foot on. She walked its decks for the first time on a Tuesday morning in April 2342, exactly 1 year after the Eden Prime massacre, and she thought about the planet it was named after and the people who had lived there and the 11 days she had spent above the scorched plain cataloging what was left. She thought about the cemetery on the eastern hill. She thought, "I will carry you with me." Commander Torres? Her new executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Aisha Patel, appeared at her shoulder, young, sharp, clearly brilliant, clearly nervous about making a good first impression. "Your ready room is prepared. The department heads are assembled for the initial briefing whenever you're ready." Rachel looked around the bridge one more time. At the stations, the crew were at their positions, watching her without quite watching her, trying to gauge who she was and what kind of commanding officer she was going to be. She met a few of their eyes. She nodded. "Let's get to work," she said. The Vethian High Council did not believe humanity would actually do it. This was, in retrospect, their second fatal mistake. But it was understandable in its way. From where they sat, 8,000 years of dominance, a civilization so old and so powerful that it had genuinely never faced an existential challenge, the idea that a species barely 300 years into space travel could pose any meaningful threat was simply not a framework they could comfortably inhabit. They had intelligence services. They knew about the shipbuilding surge. They received reports about the volunteer numbers, the weapon development programs, the training exercises. Their ambassadors attended diplomatic functions and noted the cold, flat expressions on the human faces, the absence of any willingness to negotiate, the way humans had stopped talking about the incident as a grievance and started talking about it, when they talked about it at all in diplomatic contexts, as a pending resolution. The High Council discussed it. They made some preparation. They reinforced a few of the closer strongholds. They reviewed their defensive postures. They ran their own simulations. And then they decided that humanity was posturing. That the buildup was a negotiating tactic. That at some point, when the humans had spent enough of their industrial capacity and demonstrated enough of their military commitment, they would come back to the table with demands, reparations perhaps, or territorial guarantees, or some form of formal recognition, and the hegemony would negotiate from a position of overwhelming strength and give as little as possible, and the matter would be closed. This was how interstellar politics worked in their 8,000 years of experience. Smaller species made noise. Older, stronger species waited. The noise eventually stopped. They were wrong about almost everything. But they were most wrong about one thing. They had looked at humanity and seen its youth, 300 years of spaceflight, 12 billion people, a military that was impressive for its age but nowhere near the scale of the great powers, and they had concluded that youth meant caution. That a young species facing the prospect of a real war with the Vethian hegemony would blink. They had never considered the possibility that humanity's youth meant something else entirely. It meant they still had something to be angry about. The Kreth Dominion reached out to Earth in August of 2341, 4 months after Eden Prime. The Kreth were not friends of humanity. They had their own long and complicated history of territorial disputes with the expanding human colonies, and there had been 3 separate military confrontations in the previous 3 decades. But they were also not friends of the Vethians. The Vethians had, over the centuries, treated the Kreth with exactly the same contempt they showed everyone else, and the Kreth had a long memory and a capacity for patience that humanity, frankly, could learn from. The message from the Kreth High Elder came through diplomatic channels, addressed personally to Secretary General Maria Santos, no relation to Admiral Yara Santos, though the coincidence was noted. The message said, in essence, we know what you are planning. We will not stop you. We will not help you. But we will not warn them either. And when it is over, we would like to talk. Maria Santos read the message 3 times. Then she sent back a single line, noted, we will speak when it is over. Other alien powers sent similar, if less direct, communications. The Ilori Collective, who had their own grievances with Vethian territorial behavior, sent a message through back channels that essentially said they would be looking away for the next year or so. The Mhen Accord, a small coalition of 4 species who had always been careful not to antagonize the Vethians, went conspicuously quiet. They stopped attending the interstellar diplomatic forums where their voices usually kept some balance in discussions about Vethian behavior, and their silence was itself a kind of permission. The galaxy, it seemed, was watching. And by its silence, much of it was saying, do what needs to be done. Sarah Okafor, Earth's ambassador, had been recalled from the Vethian hegemony in June of 2341. She spent the next year in a series of briefing rooms and planning sessions, providing her expertise on Vethian culture and decision-making to the military and diplomatic teams preparing for what was coming. She was consulted on questions of messaging, what to say to the Vethians before the strike, if anything, and what to say to the rest of the galactic community. It was in one of these sessions that she sat across a table from General Webb and said, they won't understand what's happening until it's already over. Webb looked at her. Explain. The Vethians have a concept, very deep in their cultural logic, goes back thousands of years, called Vethian. It roughly translates as the natural order. The idea that the hierarchy of species is fixed and self-evident and does not change except through very slow, very gradual processes that they oversee and control. She paused. When the attack comes, their initial response will not be fear. It will be confusion. Because what we're doing will not fit any model in their experience. It will not compute. And then? Webb asked. And then it will compute, Sarah said quietly. And that is when it will be over. Webb was quiet for a moment. Ambassador, he said. Is there any part of you that thinks we shouldn't do this? She looked at him for a long time. I have spent 20 years trying to understand the Vethians, she said. I have read their history, their philosophy, their poetry. I have sat in their homes, the senior diplomats, the ones who were willing to treat me as something approaching an equal, which was a small number. I have tried to see the world as they see it. Another pause. And I cannot find anywhere in my understanding of them, anything that they would understand except this. She spread her hands. They believe in power. They believe that power determines what is real and what matters. We can give them a lesson in power. It's the only language they've ever spoken. She paused once more. But General, after this is done, after the lesson is delivered, humanity will need to decide what kind of power it wants to be. Because we will have demonstrated, beyond any question, that we can destroy. What we have to demonstrate next is whether we can build something better. Webb looked at her. One thing at a time, Ambassador, he said. Yes, she agreed. One thing at a time. The final year of preparation was a thing of extraordinary human effort. The shipyards produced their 700,000th combat-ready warship on September 29, 2342, 15 days ahead of schedule. The ceremony marking the event was small and private. A few engineers, the shipyard director, a representative from USC Command. No speeches. No celebration. The shipyard director, a woman named Dr. Lin Chin who had been running the Orbital Platform 7 construction complex for 11 years, walked the length of the new ship's hull in her pressure suit and ran her gloved hand along the plating and thought about what it was going to do and where it was going to go and why it had been built. She thought about her niece, who had been living on Eden Prime as part of a university geology research program. She thought about the last message her niece had sent her, 3 days before the silence. A video message 12 minutes long showing her field work in the mountains east of New Chicago, the Shepherd's Arms, though the niece had called them the Old Men, because that's what the geology students had nicknamed them. She had been excited about a mineral formation she had found. She had been laughing. Dr. Lin Chin stood against the hull of the 700,000th warship and pressed her hand flat against its surface and closed her eyes and stood there for a while. Then she went back inside and got to work on the next one. The pilots trained. The crews trained. The commanders trained. The coordination algorithms for the simultaneous strike were tested and refined and tested again until the timing could be executed with a precision of plus or minus 30 seconds across 17 simultaneous engagements in 17 different star systems. Daniel Hayes ran the simulation 1,473 times. The first 100 times his strike wing took significant losses. By the 500th time the losses were manageable. By the 1,000th time they were minimal. By the 1,400th time he could run the full engagement sequence in a flow state so complete that he sometimes couldn't remember the run afterward. He would only know it was over because the simulation ending screen had appeared, and the score would be there, and the score would be very good. His squadron called him the Ghost. Not because he was absent, he was never absent, but because in the simulations, in the exercises, it was as if he were not quite there in the normal way. He was somewhere else. In the cockpit of his fighter, working the engagement, making decisions at a speed that had moved beyond conscious thought into something more fundamental, he was operating on a level that his squadmates recognized as extraordinary and found, privately, a little bit frightening. He didn't care what they thought. He cared about being ready. October 3, 2342. 11 days before deployment. Marcus Webb sat alone in his office above the city of Geneva and looked out at the sky. He was 63 years old, 38 years in the service, and he had spent his entire professional life thinking about how to keep humanity safe in a galaxy that was frequently indifferent to humanity's existence and occasionally actively hostile to it. He had never imagined a scenario quite like this one. He pulled up the briefing on the fleet's current status. 702,417 combat-ready warships. 51,300,000 trained military personnel. Weapons systems, supply chains, logistics networks, medical support, communications infrastructure, all of it assembled, organized, ready. The largest military force in human history. Assembled in 11 months. Because of what the Vethians had done to 2,300,000 people on a planet called Eden Prime. He thought about what Sarah Okafor had said. About what kind of power humanity wanted to be. He thought, first justice. Then we figure out the rest. He closed the briefing and opened, instead, the file he kept on his personal terminal. The one that contained the names. He didn't read them all. There were too many and there would never be enough time to read them all, that was the point and the weight of it. But he read some of them every night before he went to sleep. A different set every time. So that he would go into whatever came next carrying specific people, specific lives, not just a number. Tonight he read 83 names. He said them aloud, quietly to the empty office. Then he turned off the light and went to prepare for the end of an old world and the beginning of whatever came after. October 14, 2342. It began before dawn on Earth, in the time zone that happened to be synchronized with the coordinated departure window that the fleet planners had selected 18 months ago and had kept synchronized through every subsequent revision of the plan. The fleet had been assembling for 6 weeks. Not near Earth. The logistics of staging 700,000 warships near a single inhabited planet were impossible, and the risk of the assembly being observed by Vethian intelligence was unacceptable. Instead, the fleet had assembled at 17 separate staging areas distributed across human-controlled space, each staging area in a quiet system far from any inhabited world, shielded behind sensor-jamming platforms that had been deployed months earlier. The 17 attack fleets and the central hub fleet sat in their staging areas like held breath. At 0347 Earth Standard Time, the authorization codes went out from USC Command. They were received simultaneously by all 18 fleet commanders, confirmed, authenticated. At 0348 Earth Standard Time, 702,417 warships entered faster than light travel. They were heading to 17 different systems and one home system in Vethian space. They had 6 hours of travel time. In those 6 hours nothing was said. There was no music, no speeches, no ceremony. Ships moved through the strange compressed space of FTL travel in silence, their crews at their stations, their systems armed and ready, their commanders at their posts. On the memory of Eden, Rachel Torres sat in her command chair and looked at the FTL status display and watched the countdown. Beside her, Lieutenant Commander Aisha Patel was running through the final systems checks for the 4th time. Systems nominal, Aisha said. Weapons ready. Shields at optimal configuration. Crew is at combat readiness stations. Thank you, Commander Patel. Rachel's voice was quiet. The bridge around her was very still. Put the name on screen, please. Aisha paused. Commander? The name. I asked to have it added to the display before we dropped into the target system. A small moment of understanding, and then Aisha reached into the command interface and made the adjustment. On the main screen, below the tactical displays and the status readouts and the countdown timer, in simple white text appeared the words, "For Eden Prime." Rachel looked at it for a moment. Then she returned her eyes to the countdown and was still. In the cockpit of his fighter, a Thunderhawk 4, the newest and fastest strike craft in the fleet, Daniel Hayes was also still. His wing was docked in the launch bays of the fleet carrier Unbroken Promise, one of the 6 carriers assigned to the strike fleet targeting Vethian Stronghold 9. When the fleet dropped out of FTL, the carriers would position themselves at distance and the strike wings would launch, their specific mission to suppress the Stronghold's fighter defense screens and destroy its command and control installations while the heavy ships went to work on the military hardware. He had run this sequence in his head 1,473 times. He ran it once more. In the quiet of the cockpit, in the strange suspension of FTL travel, with 5 hours and 42 minutes remaining on the countdown, he let himself do the thing he usually did not allow during operational preparation. He let himself think about it. Not the mission. Not the tactics. The other thing. The reason. He thought about the announcement. The bar in Sydney. Pete stopping mid-sentence. The news anchor with the paper white face. The images of New Chicago. He thought about walking back to the base in the cold April night, with the streets still and the announcement still echoing in the empty air, knowing that what he was walking back to was not just his bunk and his squadron and his routine, it was the rest of his life, entirely redirected, entirely focused on a single purpose. He thought about the names. He had listened to them in the background during training, during planning sessions, during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come and he sat in the dark in his quarters and the broadcast came softly through the small speaker on his table. He hadn't meant to memorize any of them. But some had stuck, the way things stick when you're paying attention without knowing you're paying attention. Margaret Osei. She had been 12 years old. Thomas and Clara Reyes. They had been on Eden Prime for their honeymoon, visiting Clara's family. Dr. James Park. He had been 91 years old and had been one of the original terraforming engineers who built the world 40 years ago and had never left. Lin Zhao. She had been 6. He stopped himself there. 5 hours and 38 minutes. He let his mind go quiet and waited. James Obi, on the bridge of the Resolute, was thinking about the biological trace signatures of the sparks. The little creatures with 4 glowing wings. The ones the children had chased through the grass. He had never been able to stop thinking about them. They had been, to him, the specific detail that the cameras couldn't quite capture, the thing that the scorched plains couldn't quite contain in their terrible finality. The sparks were so small and so specific and so completely outside the category of things that you thought about when you thought about military strikes or interstellar politics or territorial disputes or any of the enormous abstract machinery of conflict. They had just been alive. And then they hadn't. He thought, the children who chased you. I know some of their names. I've been listening to the names for 18 months. I know some of the children's names. He thought, I'm sorry it took this long. He was aware that this was irrational. He was aware that there was nothing he could have done faster, that the fleet they had assembled was the fastest possible response to what had happened, that 18 months was, by any historical standard, an extraordinarily compressed timeline for what they had done. He was aware of all of that. He still felt like it had taken too long. 4 hours and 51 minutes. General Marcus Webb was aboard the Fleet Command ship Humanity's Answer. Not the most subtle name, but no one had objected, positioned at the center of the group attacking the Vethian central hub. He was not going to lead from behind. He had made that clear from the beginning. The command ship would be in the engagement zone, not at a safe distance watching on screens. His officers had protested. He had listened to their protests and then said with polite finality that he was going where the fleet was going. He stood at the central command station on the bridge and watched the countdown and thought about 38 years of military service and what it had all been building toward and whether any of it had prepared him for this. He had commanded fleet actions before. He had won them. He knew what combat felt like, the speed of it, the confusion. The cold thread of fear underneath the professionalism, the necessity of making decisions at a pace that was faster than careful thought could accommodate. He was ready. He was also, in some part of himself that he kept very private, terrified. Not of the Vethians. Not of losing. He had run the numbers enough times that he was as close to certain of the outcome as probability would allow. He was terrified of what came after. He thought, if we do this, when we do this, humanity will have done something that the galaxy has not seen in a very long time, if ever. A younger species, a newer species, a species that everyone has looked at and assessed as small and new and manageable, will have struck a blow so decisive, against a power so established, that the entire structure of who is powerful and who is not in this galaxy will shift. And after that, everything will be different. For humanity. In ways he could see and in ways he couldn't. He was committed to it. He had been committed to it from the moment he had read Rachel Torres's report. He was not wavering. But he let himself feel the weight of it for one more hour. Then the countdown hit 60 minutes and he straightened and he said, "All stations stand by." The Vethian Stronghold 9 was a marvel of engineering. It had been built 700 years ago and expanded and reinforced continuously since, until it had become one of the most heavily defended installations in the known galaxy. It occupied the third moon of a gas giant in a system called Vethkora by its builders, and it extended across the moon's entire surface. A vast network of armored structures, weapons emplacements, ship docking facilities, power generation systems, and command centers linked by underground corridors and protected by overlapping defensive shield generators. It housed, at any given time, approximately 11,000 Vethian warships. Its garrison was 60,000 military personnel. Another 40,000 civilian support staff. The civilians did not live on the moon itself but on a habitat station in orbit, well away from the military installations. This distinction mattered. Webb's orders on the matter of civilians had been absolute and everyone knew it. At 0954 Earth Standard Time, 6 hours and 6 minutes after departure, the human fleet assigned to Stronghold 9 dropped out of faster-than-light travel. 42,000 warships. They materialized in the system in a formation that the Vethian sensors would read as a wall. An enormous, structured formation extending across an area of space so large that the Vethian command center's initial sensor reading flagged it as a sensor malfunction. Because the number could not be right. The sensor operators recalibrated. The number was right. In the Stronghold 9 command center, the garrison commander, a senior Vethian military officer named Vethian, who had held his posting for 12 years and had never once in that time faced anything that could genuinely be called a threat, looked at the sensor display and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt uncertain. The standard Vethian tactical response to an attacking force was immediate, aggressive counteroffensive. The Vethian military doctrine held that the best defense was total offensive commitment, that any hesitation gave the attacker time to consolidate, and that the way to defend a position was to make the attacker regret approaching. Vethian ran the numbers. His 11,000 ships against 42,000. He reached for the relay channel to call for reinforcement from the neighboring strongholds. The channel was dead. He reached for it again. Dead. He tried every channel in the relay network. All dead. In 17 other Vethian systems, at precisely the same moment, 16 other garrison commanders were discovering exactly the same thing. The relay network was gone, destroyed in the first seconds of each engagement by the precise, coordinated fire of the human fleets, which had known exactly where the relay stations were and had targeted them first, above all else before any other engagement with no hesitation and no error. Vethian sat in his command chair and looked at his dead communications displays and looked at the sensor feed showing 42,000 human warships arraying themselves in formation outside his stronghold, and for the first time in his life, in his career, in his civilization's 800 years of dominance, the possibility entered his mind that he was going to lose. The human fleet opened fire. The battle for Stronghold 9 lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. Which sounds like a long time for a battle. It was not. The Vethian warships were excellent. Fast, heavily armed, crewed by soldiers who were experienced and disciplined and who did not break even when the odds became clear. They fought with everything they had. They launched in coordinated strike groups and attempted the aggressive counteroffensive that their doctrine called for, pressing into the human formation with speed and firepower. And they hurt the human fleet. They were good enough and their equipment was advanced enough that the first wave of Vethian counterattackers got through the outer defensive screen and made it to the inner formation, and they damaged ships, some severely, and killed people, and for the first 40 minutes of the battle it was not the one-sided affair that the numbers on paper had suggested it might be. But then something happened. The human fleet adapted. This was, in retrospect, the thing that the Vethians had never accounted for. Their intelligence on human military capability was based on data that was several years old and did not include the intensive training program of the last 18 months, and more importantly did not account for the thing that had driven that training, the absolute, bone-deep commitment of every human being in that fleet to what they were there to do and why. The Vethians were fighting because their doctrine said to fight. Because they were good soldiers and this was the defense of their installation and they would do their jobs to the last. The humans were fighting because of Eden Prime. The humans were fighting because of 2,300,000 names. The difference was not tactical. It was not a matter of doctrine or equipment or formation. It was something harder to quantify and impossible to train away from the side that has it or train into the side that doesn't. It was the difference between obligation and purpose. And after the first 40 minutes, as the Vethian counterattack was absorbed and the human fleet reformed and the mass driver cannons of the heavy battleships began their systematic work on the stronghold's defensive emplacements, methodical, precise, relentless, the battle shifted. It did not end quickly because the Vethians were brave and the installations were strong and the math had to be worked out in real time and at cost. But it ended. At 1411 Earth Standard Time, the last active Vethian warship in the Stronghold 9 system was destroyed. At 1423, the Stronghold 9 surface installations ceased active resistance. At 1445, the garrison commander, Vethian, sent a coded signal on a private frequency that was, in Vethian military protocol, the equivalent of a request to discuss cessation of hostilities. Commander Rachel Torres, whose memory of Eden had taken a significant hit to her secondary weapons system in the middle phase of the battle and had lost 18 crew members, received the signal and translated it and sat with it for a moment. Then she opened a fleet-wide channel. Attention all ships. Stronghold 9 is requesting cessation of hostilities. We will honor this request. All firing is to cease immediately. I repeat, all firing to cease. Stand by for prisoner handling protocol and installation securing procedures. She paused. We do not harm prisoners. We do not harm civilians. Those are our orders and I expect every person in this fleet to follow them. Torres out. She closed the channel. She sat in her command chair for a moment. Aisha Patel beside her said softly, "We did it, Commander." "Yes," Rachel said. She looked at the For Eden Prime text still visible on the main screen. "We did." She thought, I wish it brought them back. It didn't. But it was something. Across 17 star systems and one home system, at approximately the same time, within a window of 3 hours and 40 minutes, end to end, the same story played out in different variations. Some strongholds held out longer than Stronghold 9. The ones that had been reinforced in the months since Eden Prime, where the Vethians had belatedly realized something might be coming, put up fiercer resistance. The battle for Stronghold 4 lasted 9 hours. The battle for Stronghold 11 lasted 6. In both cases the outcome was the same. Some strongholds fell faster, particularly the ones in the more distant parts of Vethian space, where the garrison commanders had apparently received less intelligence about the human military buildup and were less prepared for what hit them. In every case the relay network was destroyed in the opening seconds. In every case the human fleet fought through the Vethian counterattack. In every case the stronghold fell. And at the Vethian home system, at the central hub that was the heart of the relay network and the seat of Vethian military command, General Marcus Webb's fleet of 20,000 warships faced the largest concentration of Vethian military power in the galaxy. 35,000 Vethian warships. Including the Hegemony's flagship, a vessel so large and so heavily armed that its designation in Vethian was essentially untranslatable but meant something close to the rightness of things. The battle there was the hardest. It lasted 11 hours. In those 11 hours, humanity lost more ships and more people than in all the other 17 engagements combined. But it won. Webb's command ship took 3 direct hits during the battle. The third one, from a Vethian primary weapon, breached the bridge section and killed 7 of his bridge crew and wounded 14 more, including his flag captain. Webb himself was thrown from his command station by the impact, hit a console and broke 2 ribs. He got up. He found out from his medical officer that his ribs were broken as the battle was still underway, waved off the immediate treatment and returned to his station. His flag captain, Commander Eva Barros, who had taken a fragment hit to the shoulder and was in no better shape to be standing, found him there and stood beside him without a word, her own arm in a makeshift sling that someone had improvised from a first aid kit. They stood together and ran the battle. When it was over, Eva turned to him and said simply, "Sir." "Eva," he said. "They're requesting cessation of hostilities." He nodded. He thought about Sarah Okafor and her 20 years of expertise and her assessment that this was the only language the Vethians spoke. "Granted," he said. "Cessation of hostilities pending formal negotiations. All standing orders on prisoners and civilians remain in effect." He paused. "And Eva, get that shoulder looked at." She almost smiled. It was the most expression anyone on the bridge had shown in 11 hours. "Yes, sir," she said. The Vethian High Council requested communication with Earth at 22:17 Earth Standard Time, October 14, 2342. The message was received at UESC Command, forwarded to the Secretary General's office, and from there to the Emergency Contact Network for the Security Council. Maria Santos, Secretary General of the United Earth Government, was not asleep. She had not slept since the deployment began. She read the Vethian communication request and she sat with it for exactly 1 minute, thinking about everything that had led to this moment, thinking about 2,300,000 names and the children who had chased sparks through fields of grass. Then she opened the channel. The communication between Secretary General Maria Santos and the Vethian High Council lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. It was conducted through interpreters. Sarah Okafor, recalled from her duties to serve as the primary translator, was the only human present who had the linguistic and cultural expertise to handle the nuances, and it was recorded in full and later became one of the most studied documents in interstellar diplomatic history. Maria Santos was 67 years old. She had been Secretary General for 9 years, through 3 of the most turbulent decades in human history. She had a quality that people who met her often tried and failed to describe, something in her presence that made you feel that whatever she said was very precisely what she meant, not one word more or less, and that she had thought about it carefully before she opened her mouth. She was also angry. She had been angry for 18 months. Quietly, completely, professionally angry. She had used the anger to fuel the work, the decisions, the political support for the mobilization, the diplomatic maneuvering to keep the rest of the galaxy from intervening before humanity was ready. She had kept the anger contained and controlled and pointed where it needed to be pointed. Tonight, sitting across a communication link from the people who had ordered the destruction of Eden Prime, she let a small fraction of it show. Not in her voice remained measured and composed throughout. In the precision of what she said. In the absence of any diplomatic cushioning. In the complete refusal to soften what had happened or what had been done in response. The lead Vethian counselor, not the same one who had dismissed Sarah Okafor 16 months earlier, as that counselor was apparently no longer serving in that role, though no explanation for the change was offered, opened by expressing in the formal Vethian diplomatic register, something that translated as deep regret regarding the current situation. Maria Santos said, "The current situation is that your military destroyed a human colony with a civilian population of 2,300,000 people. Would you like to begin there?" Silence on the Vethian side for a moment. Then, the action taken was in response to what the hegemony identified as territorial incursion into designated expansion space. "No," Maria Santos said. Another silence. "Secretary General?" "No," she said again. "That is not the framework for this conversation. The Eden Prime system is 40 light-years from the nearest Vethian territorial boundary. It was never claimed by the hegemony. It was never the subject of any communication, any diplomatic objection, any notification of any kind from the hegemony to the United Earth Government. There was no warning. There was no demand. There was no communication of any kind before or after the attack." She paused. "What there was 60 Vethian warships destroying a civilian world. That is what happened. That is what we are talking about." On the Vethian side there was a longer silence this time. Sarah Okafor, listening and translating, recognized something in the quality of that silence. She had spent 20 years studying the Vethians and she knew the difference between the silence of dismissal, the silence they used when they were waiting for something irrelevant to be over, and the silence of recalculation. This was recalculation. The battle results had traveled faster than the communication. The Vethian High Council already knew what had happened to their fleet. They knew that 17 strongholds had fallen. They knew that the relay network was destroyed. They knew that 35,000 warships, including their flagship, had been defeated in defense of the home system. They were, for the first time in 800 years, sitting in a position of genuine military disadvantage relative to another species. and they were thinking about what that meant. The conversation continued. Maria Santos presented Earth's terms, not demands phrased as requests, not goals dressed up as openings for negotiation. Terms. Clear, specific, non-negotiable. 1. The hegemony would issue a formal acknowledgement of responsibility for the Eden Prime massacre, in terms that did not include any framing of justification or equivalency. 2. The hegemony would agree to binding interstellar arbitration for all future territorial disputes with human-occupied space, administered by a body that included non-Vethian representation. 3. The hegemony would contribute to a restoration fund for the Eden Prime system. Not money, not reparations in any abstract sense, but actual resources and labor, Vethian engineering capability applied to the restoration of the planetary environment that had been destroyed. 4. The hegemony would release all information it possessed about the attack, ship logs, command orders, the full chain of authorization, to be used in an interstellar tribunal that would hold the individuals responsible accountable for crimes against civilian populations. 5. A permanent, jointly administered zone of demarcation would be established between Vethian space and human-occupied space, monitored by a multi-species observation force in which neither humanity nor the Vethians held controlling authority. These terms were, the Vethian lead counselor said after a long pause, comprehensive. Yes, Maria Santos said. They are. The hegemony will require time to consult. You have 14 days, Maria Santos said. After 14 days, if the hegemony has not agreed to these terms, we will discuss what comes next. I want to be clear that my preference is for these terms to be accepted. I want to be equally clear that human patience at this particular moment has certain limits. She let that land. Then she said, more quietly, this does not have to be the end of civilization for your people. It does not have to be extinction or surrender. It has to be accountability. It has to be a world in which what happened to Eden Prime cannot happen again. I'm asking you to help build that world. I'm not giving you a choice about whether to try. She paused once more. Think about what I've said. She closed the channel. Sarah Okafor across the table looked at her. They'll agree, Sarah said. Maria Santos looked back at her. I know. They'll resent it. For a long time. I know that too, Maria said. She was quiet for a moment. But resentment is manageable. An 8,000-year-old civilization that believes it has no consequences is not. She paused. We gave them consequences. Now we see what they do with them. Back in the fleet, the work of securing the Vethian strongholds was underway. This was, in some ways, the harder part. Fighting was simple. Not easy, never easy, but simple. You had an objective. You pursued it. The parameters were clear. Occupation and security of 17 massive military installations in alien space, while maintaining the protection of alien civilian populations and managing the care of tens of thousands of Vethian military prisoners, while also ensuring that your own fleet's damaged ships were repaired and your own wounded were treated and your own dead were accounted for. This was enormously complex. General Webb had planned for it. The fleet included medical ships, engineering vessels, supply chains, military police units trained in prisoner handling, diplomatic liaison officers, and a communications infrastructure capable of managing the coordination of a force of this size across 17 star systems. It also included something less expected. It included a team of xenobiologists, environmental scientists, and reconstruction specialists, assigned to the flagship, waiting. Their mission was not the military part. It would come later. On the Memory of Eden, Rachel Torres was dealing with the immediate aftermath of the battle. 18 dead. 43 wounded, 7 critically. The secondary weapons system that had been hit was offline and would need either significant repair or replacement. 2 of the ship's 4 main shield generators were operating at reduced capacity. And she had been awake for 31 hours. She dealt with the dead first, as protocol and basic human decency required. She held a service on the ship, brief because they were still in a combat zone and there were things to do, but real. She said each person's name aloud. She said what she knew about each of them, which was not everything. You could not know everything about 2,000 people, but what she knew. Senior engineer Patrick Kim, who had been aboard the Memory of Eden since its commissioning and whose nickname was Steady, because he was the calmest person on the engineering deck in any crisis. Communications specialist Amara Williams, who had been on her first deployment and who had written home to her mother every week. Gunner's mate First Class Roberto Sanchez, who had transferred to the Memory of Eden from another ship specifically to be part of the Retribution fleet and who had, in the weeks before deployment, carved a small plaque that he had attached to the inside of his locker that said, in English and in the Vethian script that he had taught himself from a language database, "We remember." She said their names. Then she went back to work. Daniel Hayes landed his fighter at 1526, after 6 hours of continuous combat operations. He sat in the cockpit for 4 minutes after landing, which was longer than he usually sat. The launch bay around him was full of the sounds of post-battle. Damage crews moving quickly, ground support teams checking the returned fighters, someone shouting an order across the bay. He sat. The mission had gone very close to the simulation. He had lost 2 pilots from his wing, Lieutenant Garcia and Ensign Kim, both gone in a concentrated Vethian counterattack in the middle phase when the enemy had found a gap in the human formation and exploited it before it could be closed. He knew them. Of course he knew them. You knew people in a wing. He sat in the cockpit and thought about them. Then he opened the canopy and climbed out and went to find out who needed him. The Vethian High Council agreed to Earth's terms on October 26, 2342. 12 days, 2 days ahead of the deadline. The agreement was not a surrender document in the traditional sense. It was carefully worded to preserve certain forms of Vethian dignity, which Sarah Okafor had advised was not unnecessary sentiment but practical necessity. A civilization that felt it had been publicly humiliated beyond recovery would find radical factions rising within it, and radical factions in an 8,000-year-old civilization with significant remaining military capability were something nobody wanted. The agreement gave the Vethians language that allowed them to describe what had happened as a resolution of conflict, and to frame the terms as a mutual agreement, rather than an imposed settlement. What it was, in substance, was everything Earth had asked for. Every single term. Including the formal acknowledgement of responsibility. Including the tribunal. Including the Restoration Fund. The news reached Earth on October 27. The reaction was muted, which surprised some observers who had expected celebration. There were gatherings. People came together, as they had in the first days after the massacre, drawn by the same instinct to be with others in significant moments. But there was no cheering, no fireworks. People embraced each other. People cried. People sat quietly. At the Volunteer Centre in Melbourne, Australia, one of the community organizations that had been reading the names of Eden Prime's dead since the beginning, the readers paused their regular reading on the morning of the 27th, and instead the community director stood up and said, simply, "We have not forgotten you. And we never will." Then they resumed the reading. There were still names to read. The Vethian Tribunal was established in January of 2343. It was, in the history of interstellar law, unprecedented. A multi-species body convened to hold specific individuals accountable for the destruction of a civilian population. Earth had pushed hard for it. The Kreth Dominion, remembering their own history with Vethian violence, co-sponsored it. 4 other species agreed to participate as observers and, in some cases, as panel members. The individuals named in the indictment were the members of the Vethian High Council who had authorized the attack on Eden Prime, the senior military commanders who had planned and executed it, and the intelligence officials who had provided the assessments of Eden Prime as a territorial threat. Assessments that, the evidence showed, they had known were factually inaccurate and had nonetheless used as justification. 37 individuals. The tribunal proceedings took 14 months. During those 14 months, the evidence was heard. The ship logs, the command orders, the internal communications, all of it was presented, translated, analyzed. The defense, the Vethian-appointed advocates, made their arguments. The prosecution made theirs. Sarah Okafor testified for 3 days. Commander Rachel Torres testified for 2. 212 survivors of the Eden Prime massacre testified, not on the planet itself, but people who had been off-world for medical treatment, people who had left for family reasons, people who had been on ships away from the colony when the attack came and had survived by the simple accident of not being home. 212 people who had lost everyone they knew and everything they had and who sat in the tribunal chamber and spoke clearly and quietly and in devastating detail about what had been taken from them. The tribunal found all 37 defendants guilty on all charges. The sentences varied. Some received life imprisonment, some received lesser terms, all received the permanent revocation of any position of authority within the Vethian hegemony. On the day the sentences were handed down, on the steps of the tribunal building, a structure that had been purpose-built for this proceeding in a neutral location agreed upon by all parties, Sarah Okafor sat down on the steps and put her face in her hands and stayed that way for a while. A colleague sat beside her. Didn't say anything. Just sat. After a while, Sarah lifted her head. "Is it enough?" her colleague asked. Sarah thought about that for a long time. "Nothing is enough," she said. "Nothing brings them back. Nothing closes that hole." She paused. "But this is something. This is the galaxy saying, this was wrong. Not just one species saying it. The galaxy saying it. She paused again. That matters. It doesn't heal. But it matters. The restoration project on Eden Prime began in March of 2343. It was, from an engineering and scientific standpoint, one of the most ambitious undertakings in the history of any civilization. The planet had been, in the technical language of the assessment teams who surveyed it, comprehensively degraded. The atmosphere had been damaged, not irreparably but significantly, requiring extensive repair. The soil, what remained of it under the fused glass, was sterile, lifeless, stripped of the biome that 42 years of careful terraforming had built. The water systems were gone. The surface geology had been altered by the energy discharge of the attack in ways that would affect environmental patterns for decades. But it was not dead. The teams of xenobiologists who had spent months aboard Webb's flagship had spent that time analyzing the pre-attack survey data from Eden Prime, the biological surveys, the environmental models, the decades of data accumulated by the colony's science teams, and had determined with careful confidence that the planet could be restored. Not in a year. Not in 10 years. In 40 years approximately. With constant effort. But it could be done. The Restoration Fund established as part of the Vethian Agreement provided significant resources. Vethian engineering technology, particularly their atmospheric processing systems, was more advanced than humanity's and could accomplish certain tasks in a fraction of the time. The interstellar community contributed. The Kreth Dominion sent environmental engineering teams. 2 of the smaller species in the Alori Collective contributed microbial restoration technology. Earth committed to a permanent human scientific presence on the planet throughout the restoration period. The lead scientist on the restoration project was Dr. Maya Chen, formerly the science officer of the UES Sentinel, who had spent 3 days analyzing Vethian hull fragments above a dead world and had requested the posting with every favor she could call in. She arrived on Eden Prime in April of 2343. She stood at the edge of what had been the valley between the Shepherd's Arms, and she looked at the plain of fused glass, and she was very quiet for a while. Then she said to her team, "All right. Let's figure out where to start." General Marcus Webb retired from active duty on November 1, 2342. He had intended to retire later, after more of the post-conflict administration was settled, but his 2 broken ribs had developed complications. He had refused to rest them properly during the battle and its aftermath, and his medical officer had essentially given him no choice. He sat in a medical bay on the Humanities Answer, being lectured by a doctor young enough to be his granddaughter, and he thought, this is probably appropriate. His retirement ceremony was held in Geneva, 3 months later, after he had healed and after the broad shape of the peace agreement had been established. He did not particularly enjoy retirement ceremonies. He stood through his own and shook the hands of his admirals and accepted the medal that the Secretary-General pinned to his chest and said the right words. Afterward, Maria Santos found him standing alone at a window, looking out at the Alps in the February snow. "What will you do?" she asked. He thought about it. "I'd like to go to Eden Prime," he said. "When it's appropriate. When Dr. Chen's team has been there long enough to have something to show. That will be a while." "I know." He paused. "I have time." Maria looked at him. "Are you all right, Marcus?" He considered the question honestly. "I will be," he said. "In time." He paused. "We did the right thing. I'm certain of that. But right things still have weight. You carry them." He looked out at the mountains. "I'll carry this one for the rest of my life." Maria Santos nodded. She understood completely. 2 years after the attack. 2 years after Eden Prime. The galaxy had not gone quiet. It never did. There were still border disputes and diplomatic tensions and the ordinary grinding complexity of 11 spacefaring civilizations sharing a galaxy that was very large but not, in the relevant ways, large enough. There were still problems to solve and negotiations to manage and crises to navigate. But something had changed. The change was not dramatic, not visible in any single moment. It was a shift in the underlying assumptions, the unspoken calculations that every spacefaring civilization makes about every other when they sit down together and decide how to behave. Before Eden Prime, the unspoken calculation about humanity had been new, capable, ambitious, but ultimately manageable. Small enough to push around if necessary. Young enough to be impressed by a show of force. After October 14, 2342, the unspoken calculation was different. It was not that humanity was suddenly beloved or universally respected or free from suspicion. The galaxy was not that simple. The Kreth Dominion still had its territorial issues with the outer human colonies. The smaller species still watched humanity's expansion with varying degrees of concern. The Vethian hegemony, working through the difficult process of complying with the tribunal's verdicts and the agreement's terms, was in no emotional position to feel warm about its new relationship with Earth. But nobody in the galaxy, looked at humanity the way they had before. The calculation had changed. And in the complex, careful, dangerous dance of interstellar civilization, calculations matter more than almost anything else. Rachel Torres was given command of a new assignment in January of 2343. The memory of Eden had been repaired, its crew supplemented to replace the losses, its systems upgraded during the 6 months it had spent in dry dock. It was structurally the same ship. In some other way, the way that things have identities that are not purely physical, it was something else. It carried its name and its history and the 18 names on the memorial plaque that had been mounted in the ship's main corridor, in a place where everyone who passed it would see it. Her new assignment was the Outer Colony Patrol Command. Not a combat role. A presence role, the assignment of a significant fleet element to continuous patrol along the corridors connecting Earth to its most distant colony worlds, visible, capable, a constant reminder to anyone observing that humanity's reach had extended and that reach was protected. She took the posting. She was honest with herself about why she had not immediately volunteered for a return to active combat command. The battle for Stronghold 9 had not broken her. Nothing that had happened had broken her, but it had left marks. The 18 names on the plaque in the corridor. The specific quality of light on the bridge the moment the firing began, and she understood, at a level below thought, that people were going to die and some of them were going to be her people. She needed time with something that was not that. Still important, still real, still serving the same purpose. But not that. The Outer Colony Patrol was honest work. She did it with the same careful, steady competence she brought to everything. She also started writing. She had never been a writer. She was a soldier, a commander, a person who worked in action rather than words. But the need had grown in the months since the battle, a need to put something down that was not a tactical report or an after-action analysis, something more personal, more true. She started with the 11 days above Eden Prime. She wrote about what she had seen and what she had thought and what she had felt in the ready room of the Sentinel when Maya Chen had told her who had done it. She wrote about the memorial service for her 18 crew members. She wrote about the For Eden Prime text on the main screen. She did not know what she was going to do with any of it. She just knew it needed to exist. Daniel Hayes went home. He hadn't been home, to Sydney, to his family's house in the suburb where he'd grown up, in 2 years. Between the training period and the deployment and the post-conflict duties and the recovery time, there had simply been no opportunity. He went home in December of 2342, 2 months after the battle. His mother opened the door when he rang the bell, and she looked at him for a moment, and then she put her arms around him. He stood on the doorstep in the December summer heat of the southern hemisphere and let her hold him, and he was very still. "You're all right," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yeah," he said. "I'm all right, Mum." He wasn't all right. Not completely. He knew that. He had learned enough about himself in the past 18 months to know the difference between being functional and being healed, and he was firmly in the functional category with the healed category still some distance ahead. But he was working on it. He spent 3 weeks at home. He slept a lot, which surprised him. He had thought the nights would be hard, and some of them were, but mostly he slept deeply and without dreams, as if his body had been waiting for permission to rest and was now taking it emphatically. He talked to his mother some. Not about the tactical details, those he didn't feel a need to share, but about the bigger shape of it. About what it had meant. About the names. About the 2 pilots he had lost. His mother listened. She did not try to make it better or fix anything. She just listened. He was more grateful for that than he knew how to say. He also, while he was home, got a message from Pete, the friend from the bar in Sydney on the day of the announcement. Pete had enlisted, as it turned out, 3 weeks after that day, had trained as a ground crew technician on fleet carriers, and had spent the deployment period doing exactly that work on the Unbroken Promise, which was the same carrier that had housed Daniel's wing. They had been on the same ship. They had not known. They met for a drink in the same bar where they had been on the day of the announcement. They sat at the same table. They did not talk about the bar or the day or the symmetry of it. They talked about other things, easier things, the way people who have been through something significant together sometimes do when they sit down in a normal place and have a normal evening and remember that there is a version of life that does not consist entirely of the extraordinary. It was a good evening. James Obi was promoted again. He did not care about the promotion. He was increasingly aware that his relationship to rank and advancement was going to be complicated for the foreseeable future. Not because he was bad at his job, quite the opposite, but because the reasons other people valued promotions were not the same as the reasons he valued his work. He requested, and was granted, a posting to the Eden Prime Restoration Science team. He arrived on Eden Prime in June of 2343, 14 months after the attack, 3 months after Dr. Maya Chen's team had begun work. The planet was still, to anyone's eyes, devastated. The fused glass planes were intact. The atmosphere, while being actively repaired, was still thin and required supplemental support for the research stations that the restoration teams had built. The mountains still bore the scarring of the attack. But the work was underway. He spent his first 3 days on the planet doing nothing except what he needed to do, walking as much of the surface as was safe to access, with a full environmental suit, moving through the landscape that he had observed for 11 days from orbit 18 months ago. Seeing it in person was different from the sensor data. The scale of it was different. The silence was different. He found, on the 4th day, a place where the fused glass had cracked, not from any human intervention but from the freeze-thaw cycle of the planetary temperature variations. And in the crack, in a tiny amount of soil that had been protected beneath the glass, something had grown. Something small. Something green. Not planted. Not seeded by the restoration team. Just alive. Surviving. Persisting in the small space that chance and physics had preserved for it. He crouched down and looked at it for a long time. He thought about the sparks. The little creatures with 4 glowing wings. He did not know if sparks would ever live on this planet again. The species might be extinct. They had been native only to Eden Prime, and the survey data didn't include sufficient biological material to attempt a reconstruction from scratch. They might be gone forever, one more small specific thing that the attack had ended. He did not know. But something was growing here. In the crack in the glass. Without help. Just growing. He took a photo with his personal device. He didn't add it to the official survey data. He kept it for himself. He stood up and he turned around and he went back to work. 3 years after Eden Prime. October 2344. The restoration project was 3 years old. The atmosphere of Eden Prime had been repaired to a point where, in certain locations and at certain altitudes, it was breathable without supplemental support for short periods. The first sections of the fused glass planes had been broken up and removed, not with anything as crude as explosives, but with the patient application of environmental engineering techniques that cracked the glass along its natural lines, allowed it to be carried away, and began the slow process of introducing soil and nutrients and microbial life to what lay beneath. It would be a long time before Eden Prime looked like anything other than a wounded world. But it was healing. Dr. Maya Chen had published 3 papers in the past year about the restoration methodology, papers that were read not just by scientists but by policymakers and planners and people who were thinking about the long-term future of human civilization across the stars. The techniques being developed on Eden Prime were, she wrote in the introduction to her first paper, applicable to any planet that had suffered significant environmental damage, whether from natural causes, accident, or deliberate attack. She did not say, or deliberate attack, as a euphemism. She said it directly. The paper was cited hundreds of times. It became, in the lexicon of interstellar environmental science, simply, the Eden paper. The Vethian hegemony was changing. This was not a thing that happened quickly or easily, and the changes were not universally embraced. The hegemony was 8,000 years old, and civilizations that old do not transform on a short timeline. But change was visible to the trained eyes of the people watching it. The tribunal had done something important. By naming individuals and holding them accountable, it had established a distinction that had not previously existed in Vethian cultural understanding. The distinction between the hegemony as a civilization and the specific actors within it who had made specific choices. The High Council members and military commanders who had authorized the attack on Eden Prime had been cast out of the hegemony's history as criminals, which meant the attack itself was now something the hegemony could acknowledge as wrong without it requiring them to condemn their entire civilization. This was a fine distinction. It was also a necessary one. A younger generation of Vethian politicians and thinkers, younger in Vethian terms which still meant centuries old by human standards, had begun to articulate a different vision of what the hegemony's place in the galaxy should be. Not the unquestioned apex. Not the self-appointed adjudicator of territorial legitimacy. Something more like a senior partner in a community, still powerful, still significant, still distinctive, but operating within a framework that acknowledged other species' right to exist and expand without requiring Vethian permission. It was a radical idea by Vethian standards. It was gaining traction. Sarah Okafor watched it from her position as Earth's new ambassador for interstellar affairs. a role that had been created specifically for her after the conflict, because the Secretary General had looked at what she had accomplished and decided that her expertise was too valuable to leave in a single posting. She watched the change in the hegemony with the careful attention of someone who had spent 20 years learning to see it accurately, neither more hopeful nor more cynical than the evidence warranted. She thought, it's real. It's slow. It might not last, but it's real. She wrote in her personal journal, they have learned that consequences exist. The question is whether they will learn anything else. She did not know the answer, but she thought the question itself was progress. The memorial was completed on April 14, 2344. Not on Eden Prime, the planet was still in no condition to host something like that. The memorial was built in orbit at the Lagrange point between Eden Prime and its moon, where it could be seen from both the planet's surface and from approaching ships. It was a ring, a kilometer-wide circle of dark stone and light, designed by an architect from New York City whose grandmother had been born on Eden Prime and who had spent 3 years on the project. The ring turned slowly in the space between the planet and the moon, and it was oriented so that at any time of day or night, it caught the light of the system's star and reflected it in a specific way. At certain angles, from certain positions in the system, the reflected light shaped itself into something that looked like a word. The word was remember. Carved into the inside face of the ring were the names. All 2,300,000 of them. Carved by hand. Every single one. The team of carvers had worked for 2 years in shifts, in vacuum suits, in the slow careful work of cutting letters into stone in zero gravity. It had taken longer than any of them had expected. They had finished 3 days before the memorial's dedication ceremony. The ceremony was attended by representatives of every human colony world, every alien civilization that had agreed to participate in the tribunal, a delegation from the Vethian hegemony. Their attendance had been the subject of significant internal debate within the hegemony, and the fact that they sent anyone at all was considered by Sarah Okafor to be quietly significant, and the 212 survivors of Eden Prime who had testified at the tribunal. Commander Rachel Torres was there. So was James Obi. So was Daniel Hayes. General Marcus Webb was there, retired, in civilian clothes, standing near the back of the gathered group on the observation platform that had been positioned to give a clear view of the memorial ring. Secretary General Maria Santos spoke. She spoke for 12 minutes. She spoke about the colony and the people who had built it and the lives they had lived and the way they had looked at the three-nebula sky. She spoke about the children who had chased sparks through the grass. She spoke about what the response to the massacre had cost, not just the military cost, the human cost, the lives of the soldiers who had died in the battles of October 14th. Their names were also on the ring, added at Rachel Torres' specific request. But the moral cost, the weight of violence even when the violence was just. She spoke about what justice meant and what it didn't mean and what the difference was between accountability and revenge and why the distinction was worth fighting to preserve even when rage made it hard to remember. And then she said very quietly near the end, they were here. They built something beautiful. They looked at a sky that no human being had ever seen before and they called it home. They raised their children under that sky. They planted their gardens and wrote their music and argued about politics and worried about money and fell in love and grew old and were as alive as anyone has ever been. She paused. We could not save them. But we can carry them. We can carry them in the choices we make in the world we build and the way we treat every civilization we share this galaxy with the knowledge that the cost of failing that responsibility is written in stone, in orbit, around a world that is learning to breathe again. She stopped. The ring turned slowly in the light of the star. Remember. After the ceremony, the gathered people dispersed slowly, the way people do when the thing that brought them together was important enough that leaving it feels like something that deserves to be done carefully. Rachel Torres found herself standing at the observation window with James Obi beside her. They looked at the ring. I found something growing, he said after a while. He told her about the crack in the glass, the small green thing, the plant that had survived because physics had preserved a tiny space for it. Rachel listened. Is it still there? She asked. It is. We've been keeping an eye on it without interfering. There are more of them now, the crack has expanded and there are 5 or 6 plants in the protected area. He paused. Maya thinks it's a grass species that was introduced during the original terraforming. Native to Earth. It survived the attack because the glass formed over it quickly enough to preserve it and the temperature differential protected the root system. Rachel thought about that. Earth grass, she said. On Eden Prime. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. That feels right, she said. Daniel Hayes stood alone at a different window at the far end of the observation platform, looking at the planet below. From up here you could see both the damage and the healing. the dark plains of fused glass in the valley where New Chicago had been. And at the edges, where the restoration teams had been working, the beginning of something different. Not green, not yet, the planet was too early in its healing for green, but a different shade of dark, a living dark soil instead of glass. He thought about the two pilots he had lost, Garcia and Kim. He thought about Margaret Osei, who had been 12 years old. He thought about Thomas and Clara Reyes on their honeymoon. He thought about Dr. James Park, 91 years old, who had helped build the world 40 years ago and had never left. He thought about Lin Zhao, who had been 6. He stood at the window and he let himself feel the full weight of it, not controlled, not managed, not directed toward anything. Just the weight. Just what it was. It was enormous. It would always be enormous. He understood that now. You did not put this down. You carried it and you decided what to do with it, and the deciding was the part of you that was still alive and still responsible. He had decided to go back. Not to combat command, not yet, maybe not ever, he was still figuring that part out. But back to service. He had requested a posting to the Pilot Training Academy, where he would spend the next 2 years teaching new fighter pilots. Not just tactics. Not just the mechanics of the aircraft and the physics of combat in space. He would teach them what you were flying for. Why it mattered. What you carried with you into the cockpit. Because the galaxy was not going to be simple after this. It was not going to be peaceful, not in the full sense of the word, maybe not ever. Humanity had proven something powerful and necessary. It had not solved the problem of a complicated, sometimes dangerous universe. What it had done was establish, clearly and beyond any future question, that it would not be silent in the face of what had been done to Eden Prime. And that mattered. Caro, it mattered more than anything. He pressed his hand flat against the observation window, the way Dr. Lin Chen had pressed her hand against the hull of the 700,000th warship. Below him the planet turned. Slowly, slowly healing. 5 years after Eden Prime. October 2346. A girl named Clara Reyes was born in a hospital in Boston, Massachusetts, on a Tuesday morning. Her parents were not the Thomas and Clara Reyes who had died on Eden Prime on their honeymoon. Those two were gone and would always be gone, and no new life could undo that. The coincidence of the name was just a coincidence, the way the universe sometimes lines up details in ways that feel meaningful without being orchestrated. But she was born. And she was alive. And her parents held her in the hospital room and looked at the face of something completely new and completely unmarked by anything that had happened before she arrived, and they were very happy. This too mattered. This too was part of the story. Daniel Hayes was at the Pilot Training Academy teaching. His third class was graduating, 31 young pilots, freshly certified, ready for their first postings. He stood at the front of the briefing room on the last day of their course and he looked at them, 22 years old, most of them. 23. A few younger. People who had been children in 2341, who had heard the announcement of Eden Prime when they were teenagers, who had grown up with the memorial ring in the sky and the names in the stone and the restoration project on the news and the Vethian tribunal in their school history curriculum. People who had grown up in the world that Eden Prime had made. He thought they didn't choose this. They were born into it. The way every generation is born into the world that the previous generations made for them without being asked. He said to them, "In a few weeks you'll go to your assignments. You'll begin your careers. Most of you will spend most of your time doing things that are not combat, patrol duty, escort missions, showing the flag along the colonial corridors, the ordinary work of keeping the peace in a galaxy that would like to be peaceful but needs reminding sometimes." He paused. "Some of you, at some point, may face something that requires more than that. I don't know when or where or what shape it will take. The galaxy is not predictable." He looked at their faces. "What I want you to remember, the thing I want you to take with you that isn't in any technical manual or tactical doctrine, is this. When you climb into your aircraft, you are not flying alone. You carry everyone who trusted you enough to put you there. You carry the people at home, the people in the colonies, the people whose names are on a stone ring orbiting a healing planet." He paused. "You carry them by being excellent at what you do. By thinking clearly and acting decisively and bringing yourself and your people home when it's possible and doing what needs to be done when it isn't." A quiet in the room. "You carry them by being the kind of power that protects instead of destroys. By being better than the worst of what this galaxy can produce." He paused once more. "We prove that humanity can fight. What I'm asking you to prove is that humanity knows what to fight for." He looked at them. Dismissed. They filed out, talking quietly among themselves, the animated energy of young people at the threshold of something large and new. He watched them go. He thought, "I hope the galaxy is gentle with you." He thought, "I hope you never need what we needed." He thought, I hope you never find out what you're capable of. He thought all three things and knew none of them were fully rational and did not care. Sarah Okafor sat in her office in Geneva and read the latest intelligence assessment from the Vethian hegemony. The assessment was, in the careful language of intelligence work, cautiously optimistic. The reform movement within the hegemony was growing. The generation of Vethians who had been young adults during the conflict of 2342, who had grown up with the certainty of Vethian supremacy as background reality and had lived through the shattering of that certainty in a single week, was moving into positions of influence. Not all of them had been changed by the experience. A significant faction within the hegemony still viewed the conflict as a temporary setback, a fluke of timing and industrial mobilization that would be corrected as the hegemony rebuilt and humanity inevitably expanded beyond its capacity to project power effectively. These were the voices that worried her most, because they were not wrong that the current situation would change over time, and their response to that fact was not accommodation but patience. But there were others. She had, over the past 5 years, developed a careful, tentative correspondence with a Vethian scholar named Vethian, a philosopher and historian who had been one of the early voices arguing, within the hegemony, that the attack on Eden Prime had been not just strategically catastrophic but morally wrong. Not by human standards. By Vethian standards. By the hegemony's own articulated values, which included, in their historical texts, their philosophical tradition, a principle that had been quietly buried for centuries. The principle that power without wisdom was not strength but corruption. Vethian had been writing about that principle for 30 years. Before October 14, 2342, he had been a marginal figure, considered an eccentric with interesting ideas that had no practical relevance. After October 14, people had started reading him. Their correspondence was formal, careful, conducted in the trade language that both species could navigate, and it touched only on philosophical and historical questions. Never on policy, never on anything that could be construed as unofficial diplomacy. Sarah was careful about that. But what emerged from those letters slowly, over 5 years, was something she would have found almost incomprehensible when she began her career. A genuine intellectual exchange with a Vethian thinker who was, in his way, trying to understand what had gone wrong and build a framework for something better. She read his latest letter carefully. In it, he wrote about the concept of Vethian, the natural order, and about how his reading of Vethian history had led him to conclude that the concept had been corrupted over the centuries from its original meaning, which was something closer to the rightness of things in the sense of moral correctness, to a justification for hierarchy and dominance. He wondered whether the original meaning could be recovered. Whether Vethian could be reinterpreted as a call not to dominate but to be worthy of one's place, to earn it, to justify it by how one treated others. He asked her at the end of the letter what she thought. She sat and thought about it for a long time. Then she began to write her reply. She wrote, "I have spent my career trying to understand your civilization. I still cannot claim to fully understand it, and I would be dishonest if I claimed otherwise. But I think you are asking exactly the right question. Whether a civilization can reinterpret its own foundational principles while remaining itself is one of the hardest things any civilization can attempt. It requires people who are willing to be considered eccentric or dangerous or wrong for as long as it takes to be considered right. I think you are one of those people. I hope the hegemony produces more of them." She paused. Then she added, "On our side of this conversation, we are asking ourselves a similar question. Having demonstrated that we can project power across 17 star systems simultaneously, having forced a reckoning with a civilization that had never experienced one, having won something that looked very much like a war, the question we are asking ourselves is what we do with that. What kind of power we choose to be. How we hold the strength we have discovered without letting it corrupt us the way it corrupted the arguments that justified Eden Prime. I do not have an answer. I think the only honest position is to keep asking the question." She sent the letter. Then she went back to work. Marcus Webb visited Eden Prime in November of 2346, 4 years after the battle, 3.5 years after the restoration project began. He arrived by civilian transport, without military escort, without ceremony. Just an old man with a retired officer's ID and a request to visit the restoration site. Myachin met him at the landing pad of the main research station. A small, functional building, nothing like what would someday be here if the plans held, but real and standing and full of people working. She took him out to the valley. The fused glass was still dominant, it would be for years yet. But it was not total. In the sections where the restoration teams had worked hardest, there was soil. Brown-black and new-looking but real soil, capable of supporting life. And in those sections things were growing. Not a forest. Not a field. Small, careful, deliberate plantings, each one part of a long, slow plan that would take decades to mature. But growing. He stood in the valley between the shepherd's arms, the mountains still scarred, still bearing the marks of what had happened here, and he looked at the growing things. He was quiet for a very long time. Maya stood beside him and did not say anything. Eventually he said, "It will really come back?" "Yes," she said. "It will take time. But yes." "The people won't come back," he said. "No," she said. "They won't." He nodded. He had known that. He had known it for 5 years. But standing here in the place itself, saying it out loud, had a weight that knowing it abstractly did not. "We should have done more to prevent it," he said. "We had intelligence about Vethian territorial doctrine. We had signals that they were becoming more assertive. We should have had the conversations earlier, put up the diplomatic barriers, made it impossible for them to believe that attacking a colony would be consequence-free." He paused. "We failed Eden Prime before they died. Not just after." Maya was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe the Vethians would have done what they did regardless of what we said. Sometimes people, civilizations, do things that no amount of advance warning would prevent, because they don't believe in the warnings until the consequences arrive. That doesn't make it not our fault." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But it means the fault is shared. And it means the lesson is not just, be more militarily prepared, though that's also true. The lesson is, build the relationships. Build the frameworks. Build the trust, even with people you don't fully understand and don't fully trust. Because the alternative is what we're standing in." He looked at the growing things. "What kind of plants are those?" he asked. "Mixed at this stage. We're introducing species in sequence, building the soil composition as we go. These ones," she pointed to the nearest section, "are nitrogen-fixing legumes. They'll prepare the soil for the next layer. And over there," she pointed to a crack in the glass near the edge of the cleared area, "that's earth grass. It survived on its own. James Obi found it. We've been watching it." He looked at the crack. The grass was visible even from here, a bright thread of green against the dark. "Earth grass," he said. "It didn't give up," she said simply. He stood and looked at it. Then very quietly he said, "Neither did we." 10 years after Eden Prime. October 2351. The restoration project on Eden Prime had reached a milestone. The valley where New Chicago had stood, the flat, wide space between the shepherd's arms, was no longer a plain of fused glass. Most of the glass had been removed over the past 7 years, broken up and carried away and processed into the building materials for the research stations and the first structures of what would eventually be a new settlement. What remained was soil, dark and rich, and in that soil things were growing. Real things. Established things. Not the careful experimental plantings of the early years, but a landscape that was beginning to look, from a distance, like what it had once been, like something alive and complex and self-sustaining. The grasses had come first. Then the low shrubs. Then in the past year the first trees, small yes, their trunks the thickness of a child's wrist, their branches reaching for a sky that was now, finally, fully repaired and clear. The atmosphere was breathable without supplemental support. The rivers were not back. The major water systems would take another decade at least. But there were streams. Seasonal flows, fed by the snow on the shepherd's arms, running down into the valley in patterns that were beginning to carve channels where channels had been before. And life that humanity had not planted was beginning to appear. The microbiome that the restoration teams had carefully rebuilt in the soil was doing its work, creating conditions that allowed species from the surrounding ecosystem, the parts of the planet that had been less severely damaged, that had survived in pockets and margins, to recolonize the valley. Insects had been spotted. Not sparks. The survey data confirmed that the spark species, the little creatures with 4 glowing wings that the children had called sparks, was extinct. That specific, unrepeatable, glowing thing was gone and would not come back. But other insects, other life. Small, patient, persistent life, doing what life does in the absence of catastrophe. Moving into available space, eating and being eaten, reproducing, adapting, filling the world. The ceremony to mark the 10th anniversary of the Eden Prime massacre was held on Earth, in Geneva, in the same building where the Security Council had met on April 10, 2341, when they had first sat with the knowledge of what had happened. It was a different kind of ceremony from the memorial dedication 5 years before. 5 years ago, the grief had still been very present, very close. The rawness of it still visible in the way people moved and spoke and held themselves. Now there was still grief. There would always be grief. That was the nature of 2,300,000 names, But the grief had settled into something that could be carried alongside other things. The ceremony included a progress report on Eden Prime, video footage of the valley, the growing things, the streams, the small trees reaching for the sky. It included a report from the Vethian tribunal. The sentences had been served or were being served, and the legal framework established by the proceedings had been cited twice in the years since in other interstellar disputes as precedent. It included a statement from the Vethian hegemony. The statement was read by a young Vethian diplomat, young by Vethian standards, which put her at about 300 years old, and it was, by any measure, extraordinary. It acknowledged, in terms that were plain and unambiguous, that the attack on Eden Prime had been wrong. It used the Vethian word for wrongness that had a specific moral connotation, the word that their philosophers used for actions that violated the fundamental principles of Vethian in its original meaning. It was, Sarah Okafor knew, she was sitting in the third row when it was read, the culmination of years of internal Vethian debate, of Vethmora's advocacy, of the slow, grinding work of a civilization trying to look honestly at what it had done and name it correctly. It did not undo anything. It did not bring anyone back. But it was said. Publicly, formally, in front of a record that would last. HFY, from this moment on, the Vethians had said it. And that was in the record now, and the record was permanent, and the names on the ring were permanent, and the planet was healing, and none of it was enough and all of it mattered. Rachel Torres was there for the ceremony. She had completed her memoir, the one she had started writing in the quiet of the Outer Colony Patrol, the one that began with 11 Days Above a Dead World, and it had been published 8 months earlier and had been read by more people than she had ever expected or intended. She was still not comfortable with that part of it, with the fact of strangers knowing the things she had put down on those pages. But she understood why it had reached people. Because it was honest. Because she had not softened anything or arranged it into something tidier than it was. She sat in the ceremony and listened and thought about the night the message from Eden Prime had first arrived at USC Command, and the 47 minutes it had taken for everyone who needed to know to read it. 47 minutes. And then 18 months of preparation and 1 day of battle and 5 years of rebuilding and 10 years of reckoning. It was not a clean story. It did not have the shape that stories were supposed to have, with clear beginnings and middles and ends and a moment when everything was resolved and the weight was lifted. The weight was not lifted. It had settled. It had become part of the structure. She thought, maybe that's what justice is in the end. Not a lifting but a settling. Not a resolution but a redistribution. The weight doesn't go away. But it stops being in freefall. It finds its place. She thought about the For Eden Prime text on her main screen. She still had it there. On the memory of Eden, on every ship she commanded, she still had it there. Not as a reminder, she did not need a reminder, but as a statement. A declaration. We were here. They were here. This mattered. James Obi was on Eden Prime on the 10th anniversary. He was one of the people who had chosen to stay. He had extended his posting year after year, until the posting had become, quietly, his life. He was the head of the biological restoration team now, the person who had spent 10 years closer to this planet than probably any other human being. He knew every section of the restoration project. He knew where every planting had been made and how it had done and what had worked and what hadn't. He knew the seasonal patterns of the emerging ecosystem, the way the streams ran in different configurations depending on the snowpack on the mountains, the particular quality of the light at different times of year as the repaired atmosphere changed the way the stars' light scattered. He knew this place. On the morning of October 14, 2351, he walked out to the crack in the glass where he had first found the earth grass 10 years ago. The crack was part of a larger cleared area now. The glass on either side had been removed, and the soil around it had been incorporated into the restoration planting. The original crack, the specific place where he had first crouched down and seen something alive in the wreckage, was barely distinguishable anymore. The grass had spread. It was part of a larger landscape now, continuous with the new soil and the new plantings, no longer separate or special or alone. He stood there. He thought about the sparks. He thought, they're gone. That specific light is gone. I don't know if I'll ever stop being sad about that. He thought, but this is here. This grass, this soil, these trees that are barely trees yet but will be. This air that I can breathe without a suit for the first time in 10 years. This is here. He sat down in the grass. He sat there for a long time in the morning light of a healing world, and he let himself feel, not just the grief which was always there and always would be, but the other thing. The thing that grew beside grief when you let it. He didn't have a perfect word for it. It wasn't happiness, it was something quieter and more serious than happiness. It was something like the feeling of having done what needed to be done, and of watching the consequence of that slow work become real. It was the feeling of a world learning to breathe. He sat in the grass. The light moved. He breathed. Daniel Hayes was teaching his 9th class when the 10th anniversary arrived. He paused the training session that morning and he did something he didn't usually do in the middle of a course. He told them why he did what he did. Not the tactical version, not the strategic version. The personal version. He told them about the bar in Sydney and Pete stopping mid-sentence. He told them about walking back to the base in the April night. He told them about the simulation he had run 1,473 times and about Garcia and Kim. He told them about the memorial ring and the names in the stone. He told them about an old general with 2 broken ribs who had stood at his command station through an 11-hour battle and never asked anyone else to carry more than he was carrying. He told them about a planet that was, right now, on this 10th anniversary morning, growing grass in the valley where a city had stood. Then he said, "The galaxy is going to keep being complicated. The Vethian hegemony is changing, but it is not changed. That work is not done and may never be fully done. There are other powers out there with their own calculations and their own histories and their own capacity for the kinds of decisions that lead to the kinds of consequences we've been living with for 10 years. You are going to fly in that galaxy. You are going to protect things in that galaxy." He looked at them. "What you carry when you do that, the names, the weight, the knowledge of what it costs when we fail, that is not a burden. That is your compass. That is the thing that tells you the difference between power and violence, between strength and cruelty, between a mission that is worth the cost and one that only looks like it is." He paused. "Know the difference. Fly like you know the difference." He looked at their faces, young, attentive, unmarked by what was coming, carrying the beginning of the understanding he was trying to give them. "Dismissed," he said. Sarah Okafor retired from active diplomatic service in 2351, the same year as the 10th anniversary. She was 62 years old. She had spent 25 years studying and working with and arguing with and trying to understand the Vethian hegemony, and before that she had spent years studying every other spacefaring civilization the galaxy had produced, and she was, by any measure, exhausted. She retired to a small house on the coast of Portugal, where the Atlantic came in heavy and gray in the winter and bright and warm in the summer, and she spent her first 3 months doing almost nothing. Then she started writing. Not diplomatic cables. Not intelligence assessments. Not the careful, hedged language of someone who has to stand behind every word in an official capacity. Something else. She wrote about what she had seen and learned and done and thought across 25 years of trying to be a bridge between species that did not naturally understand each other. She wrote about Eden Prime and what it had meant and what it had cost. She wrote about Veth Mora and their 10-year correspondence and the slow, strange, improbable possibility that had emerged from it. She wrote about Maria Santos and Marcus Webb and Rachel Torres and all the others, the named and the unnamed, the ones who had made the decisions and the ones who had carried them out and the ones who had simply kept working at the things that needed working at. She wrote about the sparks. The chapter about the sparks was the one she spent the longest on. It was the shortest chapter in the book, less than 3 pages, but she rewrote it 47 times. It was about extinction and about what it meant that a specific thing, a unique and unrepeatable thing, could be ended in a moment by something that did not know or care that it was unique and unrepeatable. It was about what we owe to the things we cannot recover. She did not have an answer. She just had the question carefully held. The book was published in 2353. It was called, simply, The Language of Consequence. The dedication read, "For the sparks. For the children who chase them. For the world that is learning to breathe." On Eden Prime in October of 2352, 11 years after the massacre, Dr. Maya Chen's team made an unexpected discovery. In the northern mountain region, the part of the Shepherd's Arms that had been less severely damaged, that had preserved a pocket of original Eden Prime ecosystem throughout the disaster, they found in a deep canyon carved by an ancient river, a biological community that their surveys had not previously documented. A thriving, complex ecosystem. Far older than the human colony. A remnant of whatever had been alive on Eden Prime before humanity arrived to remake it. And in that ecosystem something moved. Something small. Something that caught the light in a particular way. The survey drone footage was reviewed by the biology team, then by Maya Chen, then sent to James Obi in his lab at the main research station. He watched it twice. Then he put his face in his hands. He stayed that way for a while. Then he took his face out of his hands and looked at the footage again. On the screen, in the footage from the northern canyon, in the deep shade of the canyon walls where the light came through in narrow golden shafts from above, something moved. Small. Delicate. 4 pairs of wings. Faintly, unmistakably glowing. Not dead. Not extinct. Hiding. Waiting, In the deep places, in the parts of the world that the catastrophe had not reached for the world to be safe enough to come back to. SYMGHY. From this moment, James Obi knew that the report he was about to write was going to change everything about the restoration plan. They would need to be more careful, more deliberate. They would need to learn about the canyon ecosystem before they changed anything, would need to understand what the sparks needed and how they had survived and what conditions would allow them to gradually expand back into the restored valley. It would take time. It would take patience. It would take the kind of careful, sustained attention that was harder in some ways than any battle. But they were there. The sparks were still there. He picked up his communicator. He called Maya Chin. He said very quietly, "Maya, I need you to see something." The message went out to Earth on October 14, 2352. 11 years to the day after the massacre. The message was short, just the footage with a brief explanatory note from Dr. Maya Chen's team. No elaboration. None was needed. The footage was of a canyon in the northern mountains of Eden Prime. The footage showed something small and delicate moving in the golden light. Something with 4 pairs of wings. Something glowing. The message reached Earth and it was seen by people who had been reading names for 11 years. People who had stood in Central Park in the April cold. People who had stood in lines that stretched for blocks to put their names on a volunteer list. People who had worked 12-hour shifts in the shipyards. People who had flown simulations 1,400 times and lost people they loved and kept going. It was seen by a retired general sitting in his garden in what had once been the most beautiful part of Switzerland, who watched it on a small screen in the afternoon light and said nothing, just watched. It was seen by a retired ambassador writing at a desk on the coast of Portugal, who watched it and thought about the chapter she had spent the longest on and about the question she had tried to hold carefully. It was seen by a flight instructor in a pilot training academy who watched it with his current class. Unexpected, the footage appearing in the middle of a morning that had been going to be about engine calibration and became something else entirely. It was seen by a naval officer on the bridge of a heavy battleship traveling the outer colonial corridor, who watched it in her ready room and then sat very still for a while and then wrote 2 more pages of her second book. It was seen by a scientist in a research station on a healing planet who had already seen it first and who went back and watched it again when the responses started coming in, watching other people see what he had seen, watching the footage do in other hearts what it had done in his. The sparks were alive. They had survived. They were small, and there were not many of them, and it would take years of careful work before they could safely expand beyond their canyon refuge. They might never return to the numbers they had reached when the colony was alive. The world had changed too much. But they were there. They glowed. 20 years after Eden Prime. October 2361. The valley between the shepherd's arms was green. Not fully, it was a new green, a young green, the green of a world that was still in the early chapters of its recovery and knew it. The trees were no longer saplings, but they were not yet what they would one day be. The grass was thick and real, but the soil beneath it was still being built, still developing the depth and complexity that came from decades of uninterrupted biological activity. The rivers were not back. Not completely. But the streams had grown and the watershed was functioning, and in the wet season, the valley floor shone with water that moved. The memorial ring still turned in orbit. Remember. The names still glowed in the light of the star. And in the northern mountains, in the canyon and in the steadily expanding territory around it, in the places where the restoration teams had worked with the same patient attention that had been brought to everything on this planet, the sparks flew. Their numbers were small, a few thousand individuals the biologists estimated, compared to the millions that had populated the pre-massacre ecosystem. It would take generations for them to recover, if they recovered. The canyon was now a protected zone, no human entry without full ecological protocols, every interaction carefully managed and recorded and analyzed. But they flew. At dusk, when the light from the star touched the rim of the canyon and came angling in at a specific angle that happened every evening for about 40 minutes before the sun dropped below the shepherd's arms, you could see them from the research station if you climbed to the roof with a good pair of binoculars. Small. Delicate. 4 pairs of wings. Faintly glowing gold in the last light of the day. On the 20th anniversary, a group of 23 people made the journey to Eden Prime to be on the planet itself. Among them were James Obi, who had never really left, Dr. Maya Chin, who was still the head of the restoration project but spent more time now training the next generation of restoration scientists than doing the field work herself, Commander Aisha Patel, who had her own command now but had requested leave for this specific occasion, and 4 of the 212 survivors who had testified at the tribunal, now old enough to have grandchildren of their own, who had wanted to see what had become of the world they had known. Rachel Torres was there. She had requested transport and had been given it without question, and she had arrived 3 days before the anniversary and spent those 3 days walking the planet. Not just the restoration zone in the valley but the outer areas, the mountains, the sections that were still raw and unhealed, and honest about how much remained to be done. She had walked to the eastern hill. The hill where the cemetery had been. There was nothing there now that was recognizable as a cemetery. The attack had erased it as completely as it had erased everything else. But the hill itself was there, and the soil that had been laid down by the restoration teams was there, and things were growing. She stood on the eastern hill and looked at the valley. It was, on this autumn morning, extraordinarily beautiful. Not the beauty it had been, that specific beauty, the three nebulous sky and the silver rivers and the white geometry of New Chicago, was gone and would never be exactly repeated. But a beauty that was real. A morning light on green things growing, on a sky that was clear and breathable, on a world that had looked at what had been done to it and had, slowly, stubbornly, without asking anyone's permission, begun to heal. She stood there for a long time. She thought, I see you. She thought, I didn't forget. She thought, look what is growing here.